What if somewhere in the silence of the desert, hidden away from the eyes of kings and the records of scribes, there was a book that told the story of time itself? Not just the story of days and nights passing, but the secret rhythm of creation, a calendar written not by men, but by the very angels who watch the world take its first breath. Imagine a scroll so ancient that its words carried the weight of eternity, a book so quiet that it spoke not in noise, but in the still pulse of sacred cycles. Close your eyes and picture the desert at night. The sand lies unmoving, touched only by the gentle wind. The stars scatter like soft sparks across the endless sky. Somewhere in that silence, on the towering slopes of Mount Sinai, a man stands in awe. His name is Moses. His feet are bare, for the ground is holy. His heart beats slowly, steady as the mountain itself. And in the hushed air, there is a presence, unseen yet undeniable. The story says that here at Sinai, Moses was not only given the law carved into stone, but also a secret record, whispered by an angel of the presence. A book meant not for the eyes of all, but for those chosen to carry its mystery. They called it the Book of Jubilees. To most of the world, it would remain hidden, a forgotten manuscript drifting at the edges of memory. But within its lines, the very fabric of time was folded. Every year, every week, every day, placed in order as if heaven itself kept count. The mountain rises, dark and solemn, against the night sky. Moses listens. The angel's voice is calm, almost like a river flowing in the quiet. There is no rush, no storm, just stillness. The words tell of cycles, 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 years, and the great spans of 49, called Jubilees. Time is not chaos here. Time is a song, steady and unbroken. It is a gentle rhythm meant to guide the steps of humankind, keeping them in harmony with the heavens. In the soft glow of firelight, Moses feels as though the mountain itself is alive. The stones beneath his hands hum with ancient truth. The sky overhead holds more than stars. It holds the unseen order of creation. Every blade of grass, every grain of sand, every gust of wind belongs to the same eternal pattern. And now, through the angel's quiet teaching, that hidden pattern is being written into a book that few would ever see. The world knows Genesis, the story of beginnings. But this secret book, the Book of Jubilees, tells it again, slowly, gently, as though retelling a bedtime tale. It counts the years, places every event upon its proper mark, and reminds the listener that nothing is lost in the eyes of heaven. Not a tear, not a sigh, not a single heartbeat slips through the cracks of time. Everything is remembered. Everything rests within the great calendar of God. Imagine sitting in the dark, wrapped in silence, as Moses once did. The angel's words do not thunder, they soothe. They speak of Adam, of Eve, of their children. They speak of the rising of nations and the wandering of families. They tell of covenants written long before men put ink to parchment. And always beneath the story, there is the quiet rhythm of time. 7 upon 7, Jubilee upon Jubilee. Like the soft turning of seasons, like the waxing and waning of the moon, like the breath of the earth itself. The desert grows colder as the night drifts on. The mountain is wrapped in shadows, yet within those shadows rests a flame that never dies. Moses will descend carrying commandments for his people, but he will also carry this hidden tale, a story too delicate for all to hold, but too sacred to be forgotten. And though most of the world will not hear it for centuries, the Book of Jubilees will wait like a hidden well in the wilderness until its time comes to be uncovered. Perhaps that is why you are here now, listening to these words. Perhaps the story has waited for you. The angel's whisper carries across time, not bound by the desert, not bound by the mountain. It reaches into your quiet space, wherever you are. And as your eyes grow heavy, you too can feel the slow rhythm of this ancient calendar, steadying your heart, calming your thoughts, reminding you that all of life moves within a pattern more beautiful than we can see. The stars still shine, the sand still shifts, the mountain still holds its silence, and the hidden book still rests, waiting to tell its story once more. Before we continue deeper into this gentle tale, I would like to ask something from you. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so that more hearts can find rest in stories like this. Share this video with a friend who needs peace tonight. And as you listen, let us know where you are joining from. What is your name? Which city do you call home? And at what hour of the night are you watching? Write it softly in the comments below. May Jesus bless you for every small act of kindness. There was nothing like the night on Sinai. The mountain was covered in darkness, but there was a glow, a subdued brightness that was not of this world, even in its silence. Moses had already heard the words written on stone tablets and stood shaking in the fire of God's presence. But now he was pulled into something more profound and hidden. His heart was steady, his hands were open, and a messenger unlike any he had ever seen among men stood in front of him. This was no ephemeral dream or vision. Radiant and unflinching, the angel of the presence stood as if the mountain itself were bowing under his feet. There were no clamorous proclamations or hasty orders. As someone who possesses the language of creation itself, the angel spoke. Every word had a rhythm older than the stars and was both delicate and heavy. Moses' breathing slowed as he listened, as though his soul was straining to hear every word. The angel did not use the Hebrew people's well-known speech patterns, the Canaanite language or the Egyptian language. It was a different voice, a celestial rhythm that seemed to transcend the bounds of sound. The words seemed to come to life, as if they were woven into the atmosphere rather than just spoken, connecting the earth and the sky with unseen threads. What he was about to receive, the angel informed him, was not for the ears of the nations, not even for all of Israel's children. Written by the watchers of heaven, who were present when the world's foundations were laid, rather than by humans, it was a record that had been concealed since the beginning. Every event, covenant, promise, and failure was arranged in chronological order in this book, which was the memory of creation itself. Because it was saved for the one selected to ascend the sacred mountain and listen in silence, no king had ever read it, and no priest had ever held it. As the angel extended something that glistened like a scroll of light, Moses lowered his gaze. It wasn't parchment as men understood it. Despite not tearing or bending, it was as strong as stone and as soft as water. The letters on it gave off a slight glow, as if they were all alive with the breath of heaven. They weren't scribes' ink stains or chisels' rough scratches. Every symbol was a spark from the everlasting fire, and every mark was a flame. These were the writings of time, the measure of days and weeks, the quiet unfolding of jubilees, the angel clarified. The counting started the moment light broke through the darkness at the first dawn. Creation took 7 days, seasons took 7 weeks, cycles took 7 years, and they were crowned jubilees after 49 years. This record did not lose anything. Kingdoms rising and falling, mothers crying, children laughing, tribes wandering, all of these events were measured and recorded in their precise moment. When Moses' fingers touched the glowing letters, he felt no heat or burning, as if he had been pulled forward by an irresistible force. Rather, a serenity washed over him like cool water cascading from snow-capped mountains. The letters were removed from the scroll. They sank softly into his mind and rose into his vision, seemingly alive. It wasn't knowledge as academics define it, nor was it memory as men understand memory. It seemed as though the designs of heaven were being carved into his soul itself. The angel's voice was steady as a distant drum beat, and he spoke slowly. This is the beginning's record, the memory of all generations. The stories of Noah and the flood, Adam and his offspring, and the dispersed and reassembled nations are all told here. These are the promises made and the covenants sworn. This calendar contains all of time, holy days and years, and those who follow it will walk in harmony with heaven. On that enormous mountain, Moses felt small, but he also felt like he was being held by something much bigger than himself. He realized that not everyone should see this book. It was not a weapon to be wielded, a treasure to be exchanged, or a crown for kings to don. It was a silent, solemn gift that served as a reminder that history is not chaotic, but rather orderly, and that it should be remembered with care. He felt the weight of generations bearing down on him, but it was the steady weight of truth, not a burden. The angel went on to say that people had frequently lost their sense of time. They followed fictitious calendars and measured the passing of nations rather than the motion of the heavens to determine the number of days. They chose their own measures that deviated from harmony, forgetting the original pattern. However, everything was kept in this record. The seasons, the festivals, and the Sabbaths are all written in cycles that never faltered or broke. Men's lives would be in harmony with the rhythm of creation itself if they adhered to this order. As the angel spoke, the night grew darker, and Moses listened without considering food or rest. Below, the desert was dark and silent. The words seemed to cause the stars above to pulse in time. Time itself seemed to have slowed, anticipating the day when Moses would return bearing the memory of this secret record in addition to the commandments inscribed in stone. The task in front of him was not routine. Even though his face would be glowing with God's presence as he descended the mountain, the story would be whispered in his heart, hidden deeper than his people could see. In his memory, the Book of Jubilees would be preserved, cherished, and kept as a silent flame for future generations. The scroll of light hovered in the air between them, and the angel's presence persisted as if unwilling to go away. Moses was aware that this was not a dream or the product of his tired imagination. This covenant was given in the quiet of Sinai, away from the din of the outside world, and it was written in the language of eternity. Its rhythm would go on, pulsing beneath history like a river running beneath the earth, unseen but never ceasing, even though few would ever hear its words. With the scroll in front of him and the angel's voice inside of him, he stood motionless on the mountain. The night dragged on, the desert waited, and the pages of the divine record unfolded like the silent rotation of stars in the sky. Men tend to measure time as if it were sand between their fingers. Weeks become months, days become nights, and years ebb and flow into the distance. However, time was not allowed to scatter or dissolve in the secret record that was passed down on the heights of Sinai. Like music emanating from an eternal source, it was shaped, counted, and give. In rhythm, the angel who conversed with Moses characterized time as a living order that pulsed in cycles that started at creation itself, rather than as chaos or accident. The first measure of time was created when light and darkness, day and night, were separated from the beginning. A week was made up of 7 days, and this week served as the basis for everything. The angel disclosed that this number, 7 recurring, interlacing like threads through the fabric of creation, was the foundation of all sacred history. The cycle known as a jubilee began when weeks turned into years. Years folded into sets of 7, and 7 times 7 years, a total of 49, rose like the crest of a wave. Every jubilee was more than just a period of time. It was a crown on the years, a sign that heaven had once more turned to face the earth. The angel clarified that the actual calendar of creation was written in these jubilees. Men frequently counted days by shadows or light phases following the sun or moon, but the divine record demonstrated an alternative method. The steady rhythm by which creation itself breathed was the heartbeat of heaven, represented by the weeks of years and the jubilees. Moses listened as the angel explained the directive in soothing, flowing words, rather than in a rushed manner. "Everything is written from the first day," he stated. "Every cycle, from the beginning to the end of time, has a measure. No year escapes its place, and nothing goes unnoticed." Along with history, the designated worship times and the occasions when heaven opened up to the earth were also preserved. In order to ensure that those who followed it would never get lost, this rhythm was inscribed with Sabbaths, feasts, and sacred assemblies. Adam himself was positioned in this pattern, the angel informed Moses. During the first week, the covenant of life was established and the garden was given. The timing of Noah's deliverance was also constrained by the cycles when he survived the flood, as if their lives were a part of a magnificent song that had been written before they were even born. The events of Jacob's journey, Isaac's promise, and Abraham's calling were all set in the counting of Jubilees. Moses compared it to standing atop a mountain and listening to the sound of every generation being carried by the wind. He was shown that there were 7 cycles of 7 years in a single jubilee, with a designated season within each year. This was the steadfast order of heaven, not the nomadic men who changed calendars with kings and empires. In this, time was complete, stable, and enduring rather than brittle or broken. Its inhabitants lived in harmony with creation rather than being confounded. Every planting, harvest, and rest followed the blueprint created at the beginning of time. Even though the angel's words were gentle, they had enough impact to calm the heart. He declared, "Men have lost this measure. They forget the designated times, they submit to the counting of kings, and they follow national calendars. However, this is the calendar of heaven, which commemorates the order of creation. Its defenders move in time with eternity." The mountain itself appeared to be breathing as Moses heard these words. The stars above turned in their courses, each one leaving its mark on the vast clock of the sky, while the desert below lay in silence. Instead of speeding by him, time was circling and flowing in endless cycles, with every week serving as a reminder that creation was still resonating with the voice of its maker and every jubilee as a return. The angel revealed to him the past jubilees. This rhythm established every covenant from Adam to Noah, Noah to Abraham, and Abraham to the children of Israel. Abraham was born in one year, Noah's flood occurred in another, and the promises made to his descendants materialized in the same cycles, as if the hand of heaven were guiding them all. Moses realized that nothing happened at random. Jubilees encompassed even sadness, wandering, and exile. Then, though shrouded in mystery, the vision of days to come. The angel described future generations, kingdoms that would rise and fall, and periods when people would once more lose their sense of rhythm and seek out fictitious calendars. The cycles wouldn't stop even then, though. Silent and unfazed, they would keep turning, waiting for people who would remember. In this sense, the Jubilees were more than just numbers. They were a map that spanned centuries, leading the faithful through the wilderness and into rest. It weighed heavily on Moses' heart. He realized that this was not a book to be read in vain or to be displayed in king's courts. Those who passed by it would discover that their lives were in harmony with the holy order, as it was a living record. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. 6 years of toil, 1 year of release. 7 cycles of years, and then the Jubilee, a period of restoration when debts were paid off, land was returned, and freedom was declared. He saw the beauty of its balance. It was a reflection of mercy, as well as a measure of time. Although there was no distance between them, Moses leaned closer as the angel's voice grew even softer. The messenger declared, "This is the beat of heaven. This is how nations were established, how creation was ordered, and how promises are kept. The world falters in confusion if you forget it. You walk in harmony with the one who created everything if you keep that in mind." Moses thought he could hear the cycles revolving beneath the earth in the silence, each jubilee rolling into the next like waves on a beach. The order of heaven seemed closer than his own heartbeat in the stillness of the vast desert night. Time was a song that repeated, a pattern that held beginning and end in its embrace, rather than a river that carried men away. He was not hurried or pressured to grasp everything at once by the angel. Rather, the words came easily, and Moses sensed the rhythm becoming more and more ingrained in his soul with every breath. Knowing that nothing was overlooked or forgotten brought about a sense of calm and tranquility that went beyond simple knowledge. From the first dawn until the end of ages, the creation timeline continued uninterrupted as the cycles turned and the Jubilees crowned the years. The secret calendar of eternity, the silent revelation that time itself was written in Jubilees, steady as God's breath, and the commandments carved in stone were all given to Moses on that mountain under the watchful eye of the stars. Moses was shown a truth that the majority of the world would never hear, high on the slopes of Sinai, where the air was still and the silence seemed to go deeper than the desert valleys below. The shining ones who had stood since the beginning of time, the watchers of heaven and the keepers of order were described to him. These were organized hosts, separated into ranks, each with a specific role and a place in the creation plan, not roving fires or anonymous ghosts. The angel who spoke to Moses clarified that just as humans are obligated to their jobs and their families, angels are also obligated to their duties, performing their duties with unwavering devotion. Each of the 4 great classes that were revealed carried light and were connected to the welfare of humanity and the world. The first were the guardians of time and seasons, who maintained the very cadence of heaven's order. They kept an eye on the sun's movements, the moon's orbits, and the stars' movements. In order to prevent days from becoming misaligned and years from becoming confused, it was their responsibility to maintain the creation calendar's stability. Weeks and jubilees continued their unbroken cycles through them. Unseen but unfailing, these angels of Tim, he traced the passage of hours across the firmament like silent scribes. Without them, the Sabbaths and feasts would devolve into anarchy, and the heavenly pattern would become unanchored. Their role was both consoling and inspiring to Moses. Men may falter in their count, he knew, but these keepers stood above them, never losing the thread. The angels of presence, who stood where no man could and brought messages from the eternal, made up the second class. They carried the words of heaven into prophets' hearts, directing them with a voice that frequently sounded like stillness, like wind through leaves, rather than a loud command. It was their responsibility to remind humanity that it was not alone, and to bridge the gap between the physical world and the invisible world. These messengers carried light that illuminated the way for those selected to lead without scorching it. Through them, Moses himself now stood surrounded by fire but unburned. Noah was instructed to build. Abraham was summoned to abandon his land. Jacob was shown ladders reaching upward, and so on. They were too heavy for men to bear without shuddering, but they were also gentle enough to lead without destroying. Those who protected the living, the watchers who kept watch over humanity and the entire universe, were the third class. They carried the heavy burden of protection rather than merely observing. They traveled the earth unseen, protecting fields and flocks, escorting travelers across barren roads, and keeping watch over children while they slept. The angel explained to Moses that they were sentinels who never slept, their eyes constantly on the world. Since they themselves served another, they were not given to men to worship. Rather, they were obligated to humanity with an unbreakable devotion. They created invisible barriers when danger surged like a flood. When nations were at war, they controlled the course of events to ensure that promises would be kept. H. Earing about them made one feel small and protected, as if the wide heavens were leaning in to protect humanity's delicate breath. The angels of sanctification, who lived closest to the throne of eternity, made up the fourth class. Their responsibility was to worship continuously and without interruption, lifting the songs of light that bound the universe together. Their service was just as important, even though they weren't messengers, guardians, or timekeepers. They attested to the Creator's holiness through their unceasing adoration, and the heavens themselves found harmony in their song. Their voices reverberated in the hearts of men who looked up, even though they did not touch the ground because they were in the courts of glory. It was said that their worship filled the fabric of existence with light, and that even the silence of creation hummed with their song. It became evident to Moses as he listened that these classes were interwoven in unity rather than competing separately. The messengers carried the commands that led men into covenant. The guardians guarded the frail lives through which promises would be fulfilled. The angels of sanctification crowned it all with unwavering devotion, and the keepers of time made sure that there was order so that men could worship. It was similar to watching the heavens turn and understanding that each star had a purpose, each movement had a purpose, and each light had a duty. These classes did not act on their own initiative, the angel added. None strayed from the path that was provided to them, and none claimed authority for themselves. These angels lived in perfect obedience, finding joy in fulfilling their duties rather than being free from them, in contrast to men who frequently tried to find their own way. Envy and conflict did not split their ranks because each person understood his assigned role and celebrated it as if it were the highest honor. That example weighed heavily on Moses. He perceived them as a representation of what humanity was supposed to be, devoted to the way, unfazed by arrogance, and happy serving the eternal. The fact that there had once been people who strayed was not concealed by the angel. Softly, he described the watchers who left their post, who fled from light to shadow, and who attempted to take what was not theirs. These fallen ones no longer carried the responsibilities of heaven. Instead, they corrupted them, confusing the temporal order, substituting false visions for genuine messages, destroying instead of protecting, and blaspheming instead of praising. However, they paled in comparison to the loyal and unwavering hosts. With their light still burning as it had on the first day, the four great classes stood firm and unaffected. Moses pictured the world through their watch in the silence of that night. Above them all, choirs of light poured forth a ceaseless song. Angels moved like fire over the stars, tracing the hours. Others descended like silent messengers to whisper to the prophets, and invisible guardians walked beside the weary and lost. It was a vision of creation that was not abandoned but rather continued, with each breath contained within a harmony that was beyond human comprehension. Moses sensed the mountain's silence grow as the angels stopped. He became aware that he was being shown the hidden structure of creation itself, in addition to the responsibilities of angels. The service of heaven was written in ranks, each with a specific place and purpose, much like time was written in cycles. The world was not floating aimlessly. It was occupied, protected, and steered by creatures who had been there since the beginning, devoted to their assigned duties. Moses experienced a sense of strength and humility. He realized that he was not alone, even though it was a heavy burden to lead a nomadic people. Unseen behind him, the hosts of heaven did their duty without hesitation. The calendar he would soon teach was protected by the angels of time. When he stumbled, the messengers were there to help. The angels of sanctification filled the heavens with song that bolstered tired hearts, and the guardians watched over his people in their camps. Thus, in the light of fire and cloud, Moses received not only laws and instructions, but also the revelation of those who served silently, faithfully, and endlessly, the four classes of angels, bound in light and duty, keeping watch over both humanity and creation. The Eternal formed a figure out of the earth itself in the early days, when the earth's dust was still fresh and the rivers had just started to etch their courses through the soil. The shape was perfect in its design, but lifeless, as still as clay. Adam's eyes opened as the Creator filled the vessel with a breath that contained the essence of heaven. He saw light shimmering across the garden that had been prepared for him, where every tree produced fruit and every breeze brought tranquility. Because the seed of future generations was planted within him, his first breath not only marked the beginning of his life, but also the awakening of all humanity. Even though there was no human voice yet, he was not alone as he stood there, conscious of the softness of the grass beneath his feet. Unseen angels stood silently guard, their wings creating soft shadows that blended with the dawn light, and the garden itself seemed to sing. The garden was not like any other place the world would ever know. Its rivers carried life throughout the planet in all four directions. Fruit-laden trees leaned in his direction as if they were ready to serve. Flowers blooming in hues unknown to future generations, and vines stretching across divinely designed archways filled the air with fragrance. Attracted by the serenity emanating from this hallowed ground, every animal that walked on earth arrived fearlessly. There was no rivalry or chaos as lions rested next to deer and birds sang in flocks that filled the sky. Adam, the first caretaker, was standing in the middle of this harmony, tasked with maintaining and protecting the beauty that had been bestowed. The garden itself seemed alive, reacting to his touch, the soil embracing his hands, and the trees swaying as though they knew him, so it was not a burden, but a delight. Adam felt a silent emptiness despite the abundance of creation all around him. His voice came back to him, and he carefully named each creature, but none of them resembled him. Adam fell into a deep sleep when the Eternal noticed this. A companion was formed from the flesh that was taken from his very side. Adam's heart pounded with recognition when he woke up and saw Eve, as if he had known her all his life. She was not apart from him. Rather, she was a part of him, his flesh and bone, and the solution to his loneliness. The first man and woman stood hand in hand in a place devoid of sorrow, oblivious to anything but the goodness all around them. Like streams of tranquility, the days in the garden passed. As they strolled beneath fruit-laden trees, Adam and Eve's laughter blended with the sounds of birdsong. The water they drank from crystal-clear rivers cooled their lips and fortified their limbs. They conversed with each other in voices free from dishonesty, using straightforward language free from mistrust. Their presence seemed to have an effect on the world itself. Even the wind curved gently as it went by, and flowers leaned toward their steps. Their labor was not toil, but they did work. Pruning, watering, caring for, and enjoying the results of their labors were all part of tending the garden. There was no fear of storm or shadow, no hunger, and no unquenchable thirst. The angels watched over them, though they were frequently invisible. To prevent chaos from encroaching, some protected the garden's boundaries where light and wilderness met. Others moved silently among the trees, their shapes glimmering in the corner of the eye like fire. Instead of ruling over Adam and Eve, they were companions of a different kind, peacekeepers and light-bearers. According to legend, the angels' voices swam into the night like silver threads as Adam lifted his gaze to the stars. Though they were not yet aware of the gravity of the threat or the necessity of protection, he and Eve occasionally felt the presence of these watchers and took cover under their shadow. Two trees stood in silent majesty in the garden's center, a spot that stood out from the others. The first was the tree of life, whose fruit had a faint glow, as if it contained the breath that Adam had first been given. The other, with its branches reaching upward in solemn silence, was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam had received a clear message from the Eternal telling him to eat freely from all trees, except this one. It served as a boundary rather than a strict order, reminding them that even though everything had been given to them, not everything actually belonged to them. Adam taught Eve this, and the two of them walked past the tree without extending their hands in observance of the words. Since all of their desires had already been abundantly fulfilled, they had no reason to rebel. Evening in the garden was different from morning because the Creator himself would walk among them as the sun went down and there would be a silence. His presence made a sound that was simultaneously weighty and gentle, like wind blowing through the branches. With their hearts at peace, Adam and Eve would approach him and converse with him in the same way that kids converse with their parents. There was nothing between them. There was no hiding, no fear, and no shame. Their hearts were open, their lives were transparent, and their trust was total. As they witnessed the closeness of man to the eternal, the angels also stood in awe, their wings folded. Even time seemed to move differently back then. Days and nights passed one after the other, but there was no sense of aging or fading. Adam and Eve lived as if every second was eternal, and every breath was a gift that never faded. They were in awe of each other more than they were of the stars, the rivers, or the creatures that shared their surroundings. Adam's voice was powerful, carrying the sound of the first song ever uttered, and Eve's eyes mirrored the beauty of the garden itself. Joy was not yet tempered by recollections of sorrow, and love was not yet overshadowed by fear of loss. At times, the angels approached and imparted knowledge without using words. Adam's eyes might be drawn to the constellations, which would indicate the order written in the sky with a gleam of light. As Eve's hand touched the soil, someone else might lead it, revealing to her the secrets that lie within the roots and seeds. Since their hearts were still pure and untarnished by uncertainty, Adam and Eve were able to understand them even though they did not speak in human terms. With the animals, rivers, stars, and invisible hosts all moving in unison, it seemed as though all of creation had joined in their education. But even in this harmony, there was a subdued tension outside the gates, a hint of a world unconstrained by peace. Since their days were bright, Adam and Eve were unaware of it at this time, but the angels were aware and kept a constant watch. Man and woman lived in innocence, and the garden remained whole in those first breaths of humanity. Every sunrise was fresh, every shadow was just the resting place of light, and every fruit had a sweet taste. Cradled in the tranquility of a garden created by the eternal, it was the beginning of life, the first manifestation of love, and the time when heaven and humanity walked hand in hand. Both memory and promise were with Adam and Eve when they left the garden. Their innocent days were over, but life resumed outside the gates, where the soil no longer produced its produce easily, and each harvest necessitated effort and sweat. Their first sons were born into this world. The elder Cain was powerful, with eyes that studied the ground and hands designed for the plow. From ground that frequently resisted him, he learned how to break the soil, plant seeds, and harvest the results of his labor. With his heart turned toward the fields where animals grazed, Abel, the younger, had a softer touch. He patiently tended sheep, leading them to placid waters and verdant pastures. The two paths of human life, one tied to the soil and the other to living things, were represented by them together. Their parents looked on with optimism, thinking that the story of humanity would be revealed in their children's lives. Eventually, each brother presented the results of his labor to the Eternal in the form of offerings. Cain brought the produce he had picked with his own sweat from the land he tilled. Abel, on the other hand, brought the best bits of his flock's fat, the firstborn. Abel's gift was viewed favorably by the Eternal because it was more than just a physical sacrifice. It was an act of devotion, an admission of one's dependence, and a heart humbled before heaven. Despite being the product of labor, Cain's offering contained something less, a withholding, a reluctance of spirit, as if he gave because it was expected rather than because it was a result of his faith. Only the one who sees the heart was aware of this distinction, which is imperceptible to the naked eye. Anger flared up inside Cain like an unquenchable fire when he realized that his offering was not being accepted in the same manner. In mercy, the Eternal spoke softly to him. "What's causing your anger? Why do you have your face down? Will you be rejected if you act morally? Sin, however, lurks at your door if you don't. It wants you, but you have to learn how to control it." The warning was obvious and the decision was in front of him. But Cain let resentment fester. He focused his resentment on his brother rather than looking inward to examine his own heart. Envy became the prism through which he viewed Abel, and the seed of jealousy grew into a darker thought. Abel's words of devotion were like a shadow cast over him, and every act of kindness felt like a rebuke. One day, as the fields were spread wide and the sun was burning brightly, Cain spoke to Abel and guided him away from their parents. The earth's silence offered no hint of what was about to happen, and the grass bowed under their feet. Unaware of the storm brewing in his brother's heart, Abel followed without question, his trust unguarded. Cain beck. Aim enraged when they were by themselves. He struck his brother down in the field's silence, and the first human blood soaked into the ground. Once blessed by creation, the earth now drank the cry of innocence. There was a heavy, unnatural stillness that followed, as though everything in creation shrank back from what had been done. With ragged breath and hands smeared with the evidence of an unforgivable act, Cain stood over Abel's lifeless body. The silence was broken by the Eternal's voice. "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," Cain replied, his lips quivering and his heart hardened by shame. "Am I my brother's keeper?" However, it was impossible to conceal the truth. "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground," the Eternal retorted. It was not just a man's death. It was also the first break in human bonds and the shattering of innocence. The earth itself testified, groaning beneath the weight of blood that had been wrongfully spilled. In addition to killing his brother, Cain had created an irrevocable door. There was judgment because the Eternal said Cain could no longer rely on the strength of the ground he had worked. The once lightly resisting soil would now completely reject him, not producing its fruit. He would turn into a vagrant, a restless person traveling the world without a place to call home. Desperation filled Cain's heart because he felt that his punishment was more than he could handle. Even in judgment, mercy was shown, despite his fear that others would strike him down. Cain was marked by the Eternal, not as a curse but as a shield, indicating that his life was still intact despite being broken and that no one should kill him. As a result, he was sent away with the weight of his guilt and the never-ending memory of the brother he had killed. Adam and Eve wept for Abel, lamenting the son whose footsteps would never again be heard in the fields, and whose voice would never again rise in song. Their sorrow was greater than words could express. It was the sorrow of humanity's first loss. Because of their own disobedience, they had witnessed death enter the world, but now that it had affected their family, the wound would not go away. Even though Abel's life was brief, his faith persisted as a testament and a reminder that what the Eternal values is not just the product of human labor, but also the attitude of the heart. Even though his blood was silent, it was the first indication of humanity's brokenness and reverberated for generations, demanding justice. Cain built a city in the land of Nod after wandering eastward, away from the presence he had previously known. He made an effort to give his exile purpose and to erect barriers that would prevent anyone from erasing the scar of his guilt. In a world now scarred by violence, his descendants continued his legacy of striving, building, and seeking permanence. However, no wall could stop the reverberation of Abel's cries, and no city could erase the memory of what had transpired in that field. Cain's story taught humanity that unbridled jealousy can consume, and that anger can fester and destroy even blood ties. The lesson extended beyond the two brothers and was recorded in history as a warning that every heart needs to protect itself from the lurking shadow of sin. In addition to the first murder, the story of Cain and Abel also explored the precarious subject of human free will. Cain had been alerted, shown the danger, and given the opportunity to turn, but he decided not to. The pattern of human conflict became apparent at that point, the conflict between pride and contentment, resentment and humility, and love and destruction. Despite being taken, Abel's lot left a testament to devotion and a picture of faith that relied on the invisible. Cain's life came to symbolize restlessness and wandering, stemming from a heart that was turned against both his creator and his brother. Together, their tale became the first lesson in human history to be recorded in blood rather than ink. As a result, the earth bore witness, retaining in its soil the weight of Cain's guilt and the memory of Abel's innocence. Every subsequent harvest served as a reminder of what had been lost, and every grieving cry could be traced back to that initial violent act. Death would never spare humanity again, but the tragedy of the first brothers taught the world that heart decisions have a greater influence on life's trajectory than physical prowess or agricultural productivity. Not just for Cain, but for everyone who would follow him, his mark served as a reminder that life is precious, that unjustly spilled blood never goes away, and that everyone is, whether they acknowledge it or not, their brother's keeper. Since Adam and Eve continued to have children, the years following the tragedy of Cain and Abel were marked by both grief and rebirth. Even though they were still grieving over the loss, life continued on, and the earth itself seemed to be calling for fresh starts. They gave birth to sons and daughters, each of whom was unique in their own ways but still possessed traits from their parents. These kids grew up in the vast, wild places outside of Eden rather than in the comforts of the garden. Work, construction, and learning how to create stability in a world that required effort and attention to detail molded their lives. They learned the ways of the land and the care of animals from Adam and Eve, who also imparted the lessons of adversity and the memory of paradise. Simple-looking homes started to take shape. Families built shelters out of earth, wood, and stone to protect themselves from the rain and wind. Despite their modest size, these houses developed into cozy places where children's voices could be heard, laughter could be heard, and firelight could be seen. Families would gather around their hearths in the evenings to share stories and food. Adam would talk about the garden, its trees, its rivers, and the light that used to fill its paths. Eve spoke softly as she described to her kids the tranquility she experienced while living in harmony with the eternal. Even though these tales were filled with sadness, they also fostered hope, giving their kids a desire for a life that was in accordance with the will of the Creator. Every child found a place in the rhythm of life as the family grew. To bring forth harvests of grain, herbs, and fruit, some people cultivated the land while bending their backs under the sun. Others cared for flocks, herding animals through valleys and hillsides while keeping an ear out for the lowing of cattle or the bleating of lambs. Girls were taught to weave, grind grain into flour, and form clay vessels to transport water from streams. Boys helped their fathers construct animal enclosures or landmarking walls, sharpened tools, and cut wood for fires. Every household member played a part, and the seeds of communal life were planted by their combined efforts. Their days were dictated by the seasons, with each cycle bringing with it new demands. As seeds vanished into the dark earth, spring was a time of hope when planting and sowing were called for. Vigilance, crop care, and flock monitoring against predators were all necessary during the summer. With fields producing grain, trees bending with fruit, and flocks proliferating, autumn was a time for gathering. There was quiet during the winter, a to gather around the fire, share stories, and take it easy until the earth woke up again. Early human generations were bonded to the land and taught to be patient in the face of both plenty and scarcity by these rhythms, which became their heartbeat. Seth emerged as one of Adam's most significant children. Since he was born after Abel's passing, Eve saw in him a glimmer of hope, evidence that life could go on after loss. His life became a testament to the line of faith that would continue through the generations, and Seth carried with him the memory of his brother Abel's devotion. Seth marked the beginning of a lineage that would preserve the memory of the Creator's ways and weave devotion into the fabric of human history. His offspring multiplied, dispersing throughout the land, constructing houses, starting families, and assembling into small groups of relatives that started to resemble the first clans and tribes. Adam's children learned new skills and used their creativity to shape their world as generations passed. They acquired skills in forming foundations, chiseling tools, and working with stone. By heating metals in a fire and observing how they pliable and solidified, they experimented with creating tools that improved the efficiency of labor. In order to identify seasons and direct travel, they tracked constellations by observing the patterns of stars in the night sky. Even though it was acquired gradually, the body of knowledge about the earth grew with every generation. Their ability to influence their environment increased with each new finding, but it was always accompanied by a constant reminder of their reliance on the Creator for life. They also gave birth to music. Melodies and songs emerged from the strain of strings stretched across wood, from reed-made pipes, and from the rhythm of hands on hollow logs. Families gathered around their fires to sing, their voices echoing across valleys and rising into the night. Music evolved into a source of solace, a means of expressing happiness and sadness, a celebration of marriages, births, and harvests, and a way to honor the deceased. By transferring tales from one generation to the next and preserving memory, these songs carried the garden's echoes and the yearning for harmony that had been lost. The children of Adam carried a kinship bond with them, despite being dispersed throughout the land. Clans intertwined, families grew large, and marriage brought together disparate branches of the same tree. Since each child was viewed as a continuation of life's promise, they were cherished, and every new birth was welcomed with appreciation. Mothers raised their daughters, teaching them the skills necessary for everyday survival, while fathers proudly observed their sons as they learned to handle tools or manage flocks. Life was brittle and frequently in danger from disease, untamed animals, or severe weather. Nevertheless, despite its vulnerability, humanity persevered in its will to survive, develop, and populate the planet. Despite his advanced age, Adam was still a wise man. His children frequently gathered to listen to him speak because he was a living connection to the dawn of creation. He described to them the garden that had once been their home, the breath that had given him life, and the voice that had summoned him into existence. His recollections were more than just tales. They were teachings, cautions against disobedience, reminders of what had been lost, and exhortations to seek the eternal with sincerity. With her hands guiding, her voice comforting, and her faith persevering through grief, Eve continued to be a source of wisdom. She reminded her kids that the eternal had not left them even outside the garden, that every breath was precious, and that life was still a gift. Adam's children started leaving their mark on the lace, and as they dispersed farther, pathways were worn by generations of feet moving between settlements. Altars rose where families offered sacrifices, and stone circles denoted meeting spots. Once untamed and untamed, the earth started to bear the mark of human hands. Villages developed as groups of houses connected by common blood and labor, not yet cities. In addition to promoting survival, these meetings promoted culture, including customs of storytelling, religious rites, and kinship justice. Life was a tapestry of depth and simplicity in these early generations. There was no great empire, no tall monument, no great kingdom. Rather, there was earth, family, and the invisible hand of the Creator, in addition to the possibility of what could still be obtained via humility and devotion. The children of Adam lived with the memory of what had been lost. Despite being constructed of stone and wood, their homes were filled with the spirit of resiliency and the warmth of love. Even though their lives were filled with hardship, they also experienced happiness, laughter, and the beauty of music. And as a result of their increasing numbers, the earth started to reverberate with the sound of human presence, a sound that would persist into all succeeding ages. There were creatures that were not constrained by the earth's dust back when the world was young and the nights were long and quiet. Their home was in the light of the heavens, and they were bright, made to serve. But even in that ideal light, desire awoke in hearts that weren't supposed to feel it. The angels who admired the beauty of men's daughters and yearned for what was forbidden are mentioned in the Book of Jubilees. They were drawn step by step into the dark valleys of the earth by a raging hunger rather than a desire for pure affection, because they gave in to this desire and exchanged their glowing crowns for chains of darkness. Their descent was not only a fall from height, but also a fall from purpose. The narrative starts off as a calm storm. According to Jubilees, they were guardians tasked with keeping watch over humanity and should have led Adam's offspring in the direction of peace. However, their sense of obligation faltered when they gazed at mortal lives for too long. What began as a glance quickly developed into a decision, which in turn led to rebellion. They left their stations in the sky, one by one. They swore to each other that once they had decided on a course, they would not veer back. They were bound together in their defiance by that vow, which sealed their doom, and so they came down, shrouded in the thick shadows of disobedience rather than in light. Their arrival caused the earth to tremble, not with thunder or earthquakes, but with a spiritual weight that changed everything it came into contact with. Jubilees portrays them as symbols of destruction rather than strength, carrying knowledge that was never intended for human hands. They whispered secrets into men's ears, secrets of charms, weapons, and hidden arts that aroused pride and violence in the heart. They revealed the secrets of the stars to lead people astray rather than to encourage worship of the Creator. Their teachings turned into seeds, and those seeds developed into corrupt trees with roots that sunk far into the ground. Children unlike any the world had ever seen were born from their union with mortal women. Giants, tall and ferocious, with appetites too big for the land to support. When food ran out, they turned their hunger against humanity itself after devouring the harvests of men. Cries reverberated from valleys where previously only the voices of children and shepherds could be heard, and blood smeared the ground in ways never seen before. The delicate order of creation was shaken by these hybrid creatures, which were created from light and clay and turned into destructive torms. Their strength was their curse, their size was their terror, and their very existence was a wound on the world's harmony. However, their strength and the violence they incited were not the greater tragedy. It was the way people's hearts started to slant in the direction of the dark. With their children, the ghosts of the dead continued to whisper. According to Jubilees, the spirits of the giants continued to exist, restless and uneasy, even after they had died. No longer confined to physical form, they transformed into invisible shadows that wreaked havoc in people's hearts. They filled their minds with hatred and discontent and sought out the weak, the tired, and the lonely. These were not merely myths about weird creatures from the past. They were forces that permeated every part of the planet and served as a constant reminder that the scars left by the angels' rebellion would not go away with time. But the heavens were not quiet. As the ruin spread throughout his creation, the Most High, whose voice had created both stars and spirits, watched. Speaking of the decree that bound these fallen beings, Jubilees echoes the older tales. Some were shackled beneath the mountains and imprisoned in pitch-black caverns, never to be set free until the designated moment. Others were left free, their presence like a spectral wind that was always felt but could not be seen or touched. Apart from being cut off from the light, they also had to bear the burden of knowing what they had given up. The angels who stayed faithful were given the responsibility of keeping an even closer eye on humanity. They were supposed to shield the weak from the ghost's invisible claws. However, like Adam and Eve in the past, humanity frequently leaned toward the voices of temptation despite their guardianship. In addition to being their tail, the fall of these spirits served as a mirror, illustrating how easily creation could veer off course when passion overcame devotion. Jubilees describes in subdued passages how these spirits yearned for power, how they prowled around houses and fields like shadows, and how they attempted to mislead men. They were more than just antagonists from a bygone era. They were constant reminders that rebellion has a price that is felt for generations to come. It was believed that the whisper of these restless spirits was attempting to pull humanity into the same abyss they had selected for themselves whenever children misbehaved, nations fought, and greed triumphed over kindness. Thus, the memory of their descent persisted in sacred history, but in hushed tones as a warning rather than as a story to amuse. What had been made for light now flourished in darkness. Guardians had turned into seducers, and angels of brilliance had become creatures of shadow. Their story is preserved in the Book of Jubilees so that people on earth are aware of the peril of forgotten vows, the peril of misdirected desire, and the frailty of peace when the divine order is disrupted. Their tale floats through the ages like a gentle night breeze, serving as a reminder that when the heart turns away from the source of all light, even beings of light can falter. And just as the world trembled under their fall, the effects of their decision are still felt today, unseen but profound, like shadows shifting across humanity's soul. They were giant shadows that dwarfed the mountains and made men feel like blades of grass before a storm. The Nephilim did not grow up according to the typical standards of life, nor were they born in the peaceful manner of human children. They were the children of creatures who had left their heavenly positions, the daughters of men who carried the mystery of death within them and the progeny of mixed realms. According to Jubilees and other ancient texts, they were taller than the earth could support, here described as being as broad as city walls, as strong as towers, and as tall as cedar trees. They may have been awe-inspiring figures due to their strength alone, but their violence and hunger were what transformed awe into terror. The land shook when they first reached adulthood, not from earthquakes, but from the flurry of their hunger. Field crops were devoured by these giants before farmers could harvest them. They emptied storehouses, drained rivers of fish, and stripped orchards bare until there was nothing left for the people who had once farmed them. Even the earth's produce and the field's creatures, however, were unable to quench their insatiable hunger. Human flesh became their prey as their appetite soon shifted to darker feasts. The song that haunted the valleys where Nephilim roamed was made up of the cries of mothers, the laments of fathers, and the silence of children taken in the night. Their footsteps sank into the ground like falling boulders as they traveled across the land in bands covering great distances in a single stride, according to stories. No city felt safe from their shadows, villages fell under their weight, and carefully constructed walls were strewn about like straw. Those who defended themselves with weapons discovered that their arms were useless because spears broke on their bones and blades bent against their skin. What could mortals do against such a vast force that was corrupted by Earth's weakness but born of heaven's power? The only way to survive was to escape before one's house was reduced to dust and fear became a constant companion. However, the Nephilim were proud beings in addition to being destructive figures. They did not submit to the laws of heaven or earth because they believed they were superior to mortals. They established themselves as kings, requiring adoration and tribute, and constructing strongholds where men were enslaved. They were worshipped as gods in some places because, after all, what else could mortals call creatures whose size prevented them from seeing the sun? However, under their rule, misery proliferated, and the ground was soaked with blood. What started out as angels' curiosity had now turned into a series of destruction that neither the sky nor the ground could withstand. Beneath them, the earth itself seemed to moan. The order of creation twisted in their wake. Rivers dried under their excess, and once luxuriant fields turned to bareness. As though the world's very equilibrium were collapsing, animals became more barbaric, men more aggressive, women more terrified, and children less innocent. Despite having strong bodies, these giants had delicate souls. Their hearts were fueled by unending desire rather than love or compassion. They were not happy, peaceful, or content with what they had. Their lives were storms, and they left a legacy of desolation wherever they went. They are described in the Book of Jubilees as a great corruption, a blight upon creation that spreads like wood rot. Their existence was a violation of divine order. Their birth was abnormal, and their demise would be as brutal as their rule. The heavens watched as they ruled in terror, and the judgment day was drawing near. But up until then, people suffered from their oppression, leaving scars on their hearts as well as their bodies. Something in a man changes when he sees the face of a giant and witnesses his family being crushed beneath a creature too big to fight. His faith wavers, his hope wans, and the only prayer he can still utter is one of survival. They were numerous. Stories tell of whole areas teeming with them, of places no common man would venture to tread, of valleys where their prey's bones were scattered across the ground like splintered branches. The earth itself seemed to scream under their weight as they quickly multiplied, adding more of their kind with each generation. However, as they multiplied, there was also increased division because of their unrestrained violence. They battled against each other as well as against humanity. Giants squared off against one another, their conflicts causing the hills to tremble and the forests to level out like storms that split the earth. Even their strength was insufficient to quell their greed, so pride and envy among them did what men could not do with weapons. The myths of their existence had a haunting beauty despite their fear. They were symbols of forbidden power because of their size, and generations would learn from their downfall. Parents forewarned children about creatures too big to understand, whose feet could crush a whole harvest, rather than wolves or snakes. Storytellers talked about the days when giants roamed the night and when people lived in awe-inspiring and horrifying shadows that were taller than mountains. The heavens prepared a reckoning as their presence extended throughout the lands, because disorder cannot be created and maintained indefinitely. The human screams reached the throne above the stars like incense. The Most High listened, and the coming judgment would engulf the world in waters so deep that even the tallest giants would be wiped out. However, up until that point, the Nephilim persisted in their destructive rule, leaving marks on the land, the human spirit, and the collective memory of the ages. The Nephilim were more than just physical beings. They represented what occurs when the divine order is disrupted, when duty is twisted by desire, and when creation itself is abused. Inscribed in books such as Jubilees, their story illustrates the precariousness of the equilibrium between heaven and humanity, in addition to the story of enormous creatures that once roamed the earth. Their strength came from their size, their demise came from their hunger, and their destructive legacy echoes through the halls of hallowed memory. Even before the waters touched the ground, the days had become weighed down with bloodshed and grief. The ground moaned under the weight of bloodshed, and the cries of the oppressed rose above the smoke of innumerable fires. One man stood out from the cruelty that engulfed his world in the midst of that darkness because he lived in quiet faith. Noah's hammer pounded wood in time with the heartbeat of obedience as he built his ship in silence while others laughed. In addition to the weight of gopher wood, each plank held the invisible promise of survival. When the ark was finished and loomed over the plain like a second mountain, it served as a haven from an impending storm and a place of peace ready for the first raindrop to fall. Clouds began to gather like armies across the horizon, shrouding the sky that had once been bright with the warmth of the sun. A stillness that hinted at impending change weighed heavily on the thickening air. Then the sky parted, not with a light mist, but with torrents that fell as if the sky itself had broken. Paths, fields, and houses were engulfed by the raging fountains of the deep, which rushed from above and surged from below. The roar of uncontrollable waters drowned out the laughter of those who made fun of Noah. Once a source of mockery, the ark was transformed into a cradle, with the promise of a new world contained within its walls. Rain drumming on the roof inside was a constant sound, both a warning and a lullaby. Their presence served as a reminder that life was being preserved in pairs and kinds, a living library of creation, as the animals moved in their stalls, their breath warm against the cool air. With steady hands, soothing restless wings, calming uneasy steps, and bringing order to the living multitude, Noah and his family moved among them. Even though the storm outside was raging with mayhem, there was a measured calm inside those wooden walls, as if the ark itself had transformed into a tiny universe watched over by invisible hands. The old world vanished as the waters grew higher, engulfing hills, trees, and eventually mountains. The ark rose slowly, lifted on waves that reached the horizon, no longer tied to the soil of corruption. Noah could feel the rocking underfoot and the gradual rise and fall of the days. There was stillness inside, a stillness that came from trust rather than from the lack of sound, while outside, the sky was a curtain of gray and the sound of rain never stopped. The family slept to the sound of the flood, ate simple meals, and conversed quietly under the dim light of oil lamps. The water continued to fall interminably for 40 days before the skies finally cleared. The earth was still obscured by enormous seas, but the rain stopped. The only sound in the area was the soft sway of the waves as the ark drifted like a quiet island. The only things that marked time seemed to be the waiting of hearts and the care of animals. Through tiny windows, Noah peered for indications of land, but for many months, all he saw was the endless mirror of water reflecting the drab sky. Finally, the ship landed on the foothills of far-off mountains, but the summits themselves were still hidden. The promise that the voyage would eventually come to an end was conveyed by the gentle grounding, which was hardly noticeable after so many days at sea. The hand of Providence had anchored the ark, so it no longer floated freely. However, patience was necessary because the waters that had engulfed the world would not disappear overnight. As if hesitant to give up the territory they had claimed, they moved back slowly and silently. A raven was sent forth by Noah, its dark wings thudding against the air as it circled over the waters and made its way back to the ark without stopping. Afterwards, he launched a dove, its white plumage disappearing into the distance. It came back empty-handed because the land was still hidden. Before launching the dove once more, he waited 7 more days while the ark creaked softly in the stillness. This time, it came back holding a fresh, green olive leaf in its beak, a delicate representation of life emerging from the seas once more. The world was not lost. It was waiting, reborn beneath the retreating waves, and hope ignited in the hearts of those inside the ark. It was another 7 days before Noah let the dove go again, and this time it did not come back. The land was ready, the air was ready, and the bird had found its place in the world that lay ahead. Noah did not hurry, but his heart was steady. He waited for the order to arrive, for the voice that had instructed him to enter the ark to now instruct him to exit it. The door opened, letting in more light than had appeared during the lengthy months of waiting. The animals departed one by one, stepping onto still wet but living soil and spreading out into the world, their sounds filling the air. With the ground solid underfoot and the sky wide above, Noah and his family followed them outside. The air had a fresh scent, free of the corruption and bloodshed that had previously pervaded it. The rustling of animals and the cries of birds were the only sounds to break the deep silence of the land. Noah gazed at the valleys and mountains, which were now enveloped in the silence of rebirth rather than the cries of conflict or the laughter of cruelty. A new story could be written on the canvas that the flood had left behind after washing away the old. The hand that had led the ark through the storm would lead them still in this beginning. So even though Noah's heart was heavy with memories of what had been lost, it was also filled with quiet peace. Behind them, the ark loomed like a monument, its sturdy wooden frame bruised by waves and rain, a testament to the care that had seen them through the flood. As a token of appreciation, Noah constructed an altar in its shadow using hand-gathered stones and smoke that rose softly into the sky. Life had returned, bringing with it the certainty that humanity's story had not come to an end, even though the world and the soil were still delicate. The flood was more than just water. It was a purification and a restoration of the unbalanced environment. It served as a reminder that mercy can exist even in the face of judgment, and that the promise of rebirth can exist even in the midst of destruction. Noah was not punished by the long days in the ark, the soft rocking of the waves, the quiet of the boundless seas, or the gradual discovery of land. Rather, it was a journey that taught him the value of patience and trust. And as he stood on the moist ground, inhaling the clean air of a cleansed world, the silence in his heart echoed the silence of the land, a serenity that hinted at a future molded not by human violence, but by the silent leadership of the one who had brought them through the storm. The world was quiet under the clearing skies, and the rain had stopped. The smell of wet earth, a fragrance created by soil that has been cleansed by the great waters, permeated the air. Noah stood on the ground that had been submerged by the flood just days earlier. The only sounds in the vast silence surrounding him were the soft movement of animals finding their place in the restored land, and the soft drip of water from leaves. The long days spent in the ark had worn his heart, but now it stirred with awe and reverence because he realized that what lay ahead was more than just survival. It was the start of something bigger. Though the memories of judgment persisted, there was also a soft whisper of grace interwoven with the silence, and life had been preserved. He collected rough, uneven stones and carefully stacked them in an altar. The sound of waves crashing, the cries of beasts, the silence of endless nights floating on the waters, and the mocking voices of the lost seemed to weigh down every rock. He set offerings on that altar, and smoke curled upward into the freshly cleared sky as the fire ate them. Even though it was a simple act, it was filled with gratitude and the realization that the same hand that had brought the storm had also brought them safely through it. The unspoken desire that this new world would not collapse into the ruin of the one that had been washed away was carried by the smoke as it rose like a silent prayer, a bridge connecting earth and heaven. The heavens moved in silent beauty as Noah and his family stood there in that solemn moment. Even though the clouds were soft and pale against the horizon, a light that gently touched the world broke through them. Subsequently, hues woven in brilliance emerged, arching across the sky. Red, gold, green, and violet all blended harmoniously, shimmering with an earthly yet otherworldly beauty. It was a soft bow of light that silently curved from one end of heaven to the other, rather than the stern roar of thunder or the glaring blaze of fire. Noah's breath caught because he knew without words that this was more than just a coincidence of mist and sunlight. It was a promise inscribed in light, a seal that stretched across the sky like a sign. That rainbow had no voice, but its message was clear. The promise that the earth would never again be completely submerged by water was a covenant, a tie that bound the Creator and His creation together. Although corruption had been swept away by the flood, this sign signaled that humanity's history would not be doomed to destruction forever. Where storms once gathered, it now stood as a bow of peace, a symbol of mercy. More than just a lovely sight, it served as a reminder to Noah that the same God who had judged the world also made the decision to keep it intact and devoted himself to his creation. The Ark of the Rainbow served as a constant reminder that anger would not be the last word, acting as a bridge of light connecting heaven and earth. With their eyes reflecting the light from the bow above, the family watched in silence. Youngsters who had dreaded the never-ending rain now looked in awe at the hues, possibly not fully comprehending their significance, but feeling the solace they offered, as if the entire universe breathed in unison beneath its span. The animals also appeared to be soothed beneath its arch, their cries mellowed. Once engulfed in judgment and silence, the earth now appeared to be alive with hope. The rainbow added beauty to the renewal of light where the waters had destroyed it. From that point on, the covenant influenced not only the heavens but also how people would live on the planet. All subsequent generations were promised the rainbow, not just Noah. There would always be the comfort of that arc of light, even when clouds gathered and rain fell. It appeared as if the sky itself carried a symbol of remembering, a proclamation that while storms might rage, they would not devour everything. Humanity could rise again if it trusted in a mercy greater than wrath rather than fearing annihilation. As Noah started the process of starting over, the rainbow remained in his heart. As he sowed seeds that would eventually produce fruit, the soil felt soft and new under his hands. Every rut in the ground turned into an act of faith, believing that the upcoming rains would build rather than destroy. The covenant was not just about survival, it was also about restoration, the opportunity for humanity to rise and follow a path characterized by respect and accountability. After being cleansed, the earth now awaited human hands to care for it carefully and without corruption. Future generations would remember the rainbow. After storms, children would point to the sky as their elders told them the tale of the flood and the promise made to their ancestors. The colors of the rainbow served as a silent teacher, reminding people that they were obligated to the Creator, who had placed boundaries on the waters, as well as to the earth. It served as a continual reminder to live humbly, to be thankful, and to keep in mind that life itself was at the mercy of a higher power. The promise was not without weight, though. It called on humanity to walk differently than before, even though it provided reassurance that the world would not be destroyed by flood once more. The rainbow served as a reminder of accountability as well as a gift of peace. Every time its hues emerged, it seemed as if the sky was requesting, will people respect their second chance? Will they treat the land with kindness, or will they reenact the corruption and violence that caused the flood? The bow was a call as well as a consolation, reaching across the sky. After the flood, Noah had to deal with the weight of memory in addition to the blessing of survival. The memory of what had been lost affected every harvest he received. The echo of times when the world had been covered by water was present in every sunrise. Above all, though, he was reminded that humanity's story was not over, but rather resurrected every time the rains arrived and the sky cleared with vibrant colors. Whether they believed or not, his descendants would be dispersed throughout the world with that same reminder, the rainbow still arching overhead as a silent testament. The covenant was not like human agreements. It wasn't sealed with king's blood or inscribed on stone. It was visible to both devoted and stray eyes, woven into the fabric of the sky. Since the rainbow is a part of the very rhythm of creation, it did not wane with time or alter with the seasons. Its beauty speaks to both the most simple heart and the most intelligent mind, because it is a promise conveyed through the language of color and light rather than words. Standing beneath its arch means being a part of a narrative that is bigger than oneself, a narrative of mercy that spans from Noah's time to the upcoming storms. As a result, the world emerged from the seas with the help of a promise that united heaven and earth as well as the strength of soil and seed. The silent arc of the rainbow endures, connecting destruction and rebirth, mercy and judgment. With that sign above them, humanity entered the world as heirs to a covenant written across the sky rather than as aimless wanderers. There would always be light piercing through, bending into colors that whispered the same silent truth, that life would continue, that mercy would endure, and that humanity was given another chance to rise from the earth washed clean, even though storms would return, clouds would gather, and rain would fall. In the years after the Great Flood, the land was quiet, but it wasn't a void. It was full of the voices of men and women starting to mold their lives on the reborn earth, the faint rustle of wind blowing across fields, and the cries of newborns. The world's future extended from Noah's sons in a manner akin to rivers flowing in various directions, each bearing the mark of a beginning. Among them, Shem possessed a gift, a subtle yet potent legacy that would extend beyond his lifetime and into generations to come. Noah's family had witnessed mercy with their own hearts and judgment with their own eyes. The old and new worlds had been separated by the flood, and now, as his sons left, each carried a destiny that would have an impact on entire nations. Shem's share came from something much more profound, a spiritual heritage that distinguished his line, rather than just land or numerical strength. His name itself was significant, as if it were a whisper of honor and dignity, hinting at a part that would influence the course of human history. Despite his age, Noah was able to see clearly. He had spoken words over his sons that stuck like seeds in the soil of time. He pronounced blessing over Shem, a holy favor that fell upon him as if heaven itself had draped a mantle over his shoulders. This blessing was a calling that derived its strength from faith and reverence, rather than a crown made by men or a banner flown in combat. It was a gift that would last beyond Shem's lifetime because his descendants would take it into kingdoms, places of worship, and the foundation of the nations that would emerge from his household. A significant lineage that would span centuries and weave through tales of kings, prophets, and priests would emerge from the tent of Shem. Even as other nations pursued idols made of stone and wood, knowledge of the Creator would endure within his line. The Al-Kisiku, memory of covenant, was carried by Shem's house like a river that flowed steadily through time, preserving the idea that humanity's path was tied to the divine and that the world had been cleansed and renewed. The mark of blessing kept his children and their children near the sacred, unlike those who wandered in forgetfulness. Like trees planted by streams of water, Shem's household grew steadily. As the blessing grew stronger, sons were born, each bearing the promise of the rainbow and the memory of the flood. Clans and tribes emerged from them, their tents scattered across the valleys and plains, their voices bringing vitality to the atmosphere. But they weren't distinguished by their sheer numbers. Japheth and Ham also gave rise to powerful, vast nations. The thread of faith that united Shem's line was what set them apart. It would eventually produce men who walked with God, heard his voice, and spread his word to other people. Because favors come with responsibilities, Shem's blessing was also a burden. Because they carried the burden of covenant and the memory of judgment with them, his descendants were not allowed to live as they pleased. Every altar they constructed, sacrifice they made, and prayer they said was connected to Shem's legacy. His tents evolved into locations where the Creator's name was revered, where songs of thanksgiving filled the night sky, and where kids learned how to walk humbly before the invisible but ever-present God, in addition to how to tend flocks and plant fields. As the generations went by, the nations started to disperse widely. Some became restless and sought to erect towers of pride, their hearts shifting from reverence to ambition. Others created idols that were immobile and speechless in their pursuit of false gods. However, there was still a glimmer of truth in Shem's home, a constant flame that never went out. From father to, "O son," this flame would occasionally flicker but never go out until it rekindled in individuals like Abraham, who would come from Shem's line to carry the covenant into even more lucidity. Shem's people developed with purpose rather than just power. Although their armies may not have thundered across plains and their lands may not have been as vast as others at first, within them grew the seed of a promise that would eventually affect all nations. In order to bring forth teachings, laws, and prophets that would guide not only Shem's children, but also the world beyond, the Creator had decided to weave his story through their line. In addition to being a family, his home was a source of revelation and a selected lineage that stood out in the grand scheme of human history. The languages and cultures of the nations that emerged from Shem gave the world a voice. However, the unbroken line of covenant persisted despite the diversity. Not every branch received the blessing equally. Some clung more firmly, while others strayed, but the root persisted. The laws written to direct men's steps, the songs sung to honor the invisible hand that had carried them through the flood, and the prayers offered at dawn all contained the voice of Shem's inheritance. Shem's legacy was about more than just surviving. It was about preserving an unwavering light. Shem's blessing served as the cornerstone of a faith that extended well beyond his own children as the generations went by. Through him, nations would eventually hear prophetic words, receive laws from the summits of mountains, and see the rise of kings who ruled with both authority and respect. The destiny of innumerable souls would be shaped over time by the story of Shem's household, which would be recorded in both bloodlines and beliefs. Instead of growing carelessly like wild weeds, his home flourished like a well-kept vineyard, producing fruit year after year that was sweet and meant to feed the world. After the flood, a father's silent blessing became a living thread that persisted throughout history. A steady peace, an unbroken current of sacred purpose flowed through Shem's line as the nations expanded and the earth filled with people. His descendants constructed houses and fields, sang and prayed, stumbled and got back up. But the blessing always accompanied them, directing, molding, and serving as a reminder of the covenant that was carried over from the time when the world was purified. In addition to being a family, Shem's household was a chosen path, a branch that held the promise of eternity and was meant to cast its shadow over the ages, affecting everyone who would follow. The plain, a huge expanse of land beneath the sky, was open and wide, and men were congregating there in increasing numbers. Stories about the flood were still passed down from one generation to the next, but the fear that once degraded humanity faded with every year. The children of Noah had dispersed throughout fields and valleys, but eventually their voices came together in one location where ambitions started to germinate. As they gazed upon the level terrain of Shinar, which was abundant in stone and clay, they sensed the beginnings of a dream. Their hearts longed to leave their mark on the world, something so big and unbreakable that the memory of it would stretch across the heavens themselves, and they were no longer satisfied with tents and wandering. They started talking about a tower, not just a house or a stronghold, but a symbol of their power and solidarity. Their unanimity gave them courage because their voices conveyed the same language, a single tongue that ran among them like a river. They formed bricks out of the plain's clay, fired them to hardness, and then sealed them with tar. They laid the foundation one stone at a time, each one bearing pride in addition to weight. They felt closer to the heavens with each layer that rose, as though their hands could touch God's throne. However, beneath this dream was not respect, but disobedience, as their aim was not to worship, but to dominate, not to honor, but to disobey. Day after day, the people came together, their arms full of work, their songs full of victory, as walls rose higher and men spoke boldly about how their names would never be forgotten. Children watched with wide eyes. Their words, "Let us make a name for ourselves," reverberated through the atmosphere like a hymn. They were afraid of being dispersed throughout the earth, rather than of judgment or heaven, because they secretly yearned for a united power that would defy God's order to spread and populate the world. Human pride, which aimed to unite heaven and earth under human control, rose along with the tower. The building expanded not just as stone after stone, but also as a representation of unbridled ambition. Its top stretched farther with each season, its walls were sturdy, and its base was broad. Its shape astounded those who watched from afar, as if a mountain had suddenly appeared on the plain. But in the silence of the sky, there was a look that could see through the tar and bricks, through the laughter and chants. Neither the tower nor the hearts of its builders were concealed. Despite their apparent strength, the Creator recognized the danger in their unity. Because if all people, speaking the same language, turned their unity into arrogance and disobedience, their corruption would have no boundaries. So it came to pass that a decision broke the stillness of heaven. This time, it wasn't a flood, fire or trembling earth. Rather, it was something softer that pierced not the stone, but the very fabric of their speech. Suddenly, the workers' voices faltered as they shouted commands from the scaffold to the ground while lifting bricks. Once familiar words turned into unfamiliar sounds. His companion only heard a riddle when a mason called for clay. A foreman yelled for more bricks, but his men couldn't understand and just stared in disbelief. A single tongue divided into numerous ones, dispersing meaning like wind-tossed seeds. The loss of a common voice, not a sword or a storm, was what tore men apart. Like fire through parched grass, confusion swept through the camp. Where there had once been a single language, there were now numerous ones, each of which was unfamiliar to another person. Families staggered, friends stood in confusion, and leaders yelled in vain as their words rang hollow. On the plain, the tower remained erect, but the work slowed, faltered, and then stopped. What good was labor without comprehension? Hands that had once been eager to build now dropped their tools. The crowd started to disperse, congregating with those whose words they could still identify. Clans split off, groups were formed, and gradually they dispersed throughout the planet, each bearing their own language like a banner of division. Once a symbol of pride, the tower was left unfinished, a silent testament to human foolishness. Its top extended no farther than human strength permitted, its stones standing bare against the sky. What started out as a vision of unification turned into a lesson etched into the ground, a reminder that ambition devoid of humility only ends in disaster. Once alive with the sounds of song and work, the plain of Shinar was now silent, save for the wind that murmured through deserted kilns and scaffolds. The location became known as Babel because the Lord dispersed humanity throughout the earth after confusing human speech there. Although it appeared to be judgment, the scattering actually carried the shaping of nations, so it was not chaos, but design. The emerging languages developed into the foundations of civilizations and the seeds of tribes that would thrive in far-off places. The earth was populated by people from Babel, but it was also diverse, with voices carrying various songs, prayers, and tales. What appeared to be division was actually providence, making it impossible for a single people to band together in rebellion so quickly in the future. The tower vanished from memory, but its tale persisted, passed down through the ages as a truth and a warning. Babel would be remembered by generations, some with wonder and others with sadness. The great tower that reached the heavens, the day when words turned strange on their lips, and the scattering that sent their families to far-off places were all stories that parents told their children. As a reminder that the heavens are not to be taken by humans, the tower's ruins came to represent boundaries rather than glory. Confusion weighed heavily on the name of Babel, reverberating through time as a lesson encased in silence and stone. Nevertheless, there was an invisible thread even in this story of division. The goal of heaven remained intact despite the dispersion of men and the division of tongues. The earth was set up for the revelation of promises through selected lines, for nations to rise in their own lands, and for the unfolding of larger stories. Instead of marking the end of history, the confusion of Babel marked a turning point that led humanity back toward the path of covenant and away from their own pride. Thus, the tower remained unfinished, its stones worn by time and wind, its summit never reaching the sky. The people who had once envisioned connecting heaven and earth were now walking far apart, their voices peculiar but full of fresh starts. No matter how high men build, the heavens are not theirs to claim. This lesson was left in the memory of nations even after the plain was cleared and the work was undone. The story of Babel remained silent, not as a triumph, but as a silent reminder that humility grows while pride scatters, and that even though there are many men, their voices are still heard beneath the listening sky. The only sounds in the world around him were the clatter of stones and the whispers of men who used their hands to carve shape, and referred to them as gods. a young boy named Abraham walked with eyes that seemed older than his years in the land of Ur, where temples rose like mountains of clay and rivers shimmered under the sun. He had a small, unremarkable frame, but a question too big for stone idols to answer burned in his heart. In the faint light of lamps, he observed his father Terah creating figures out of stone and wood, carefully smoothing their faces as though life might burst from the carvings. Even as a young child, Abraham pondered why the eyes of these gods never moved, why their mouths never spoke, and why their hands remained rigid when men prayed for blessings. Customers came to bow, to bring gifts, and to whisper prayers to the silent shapes. At first he spoke in whispers, asking questions that made people uncomfortable. "Why must these be carried if they are gods?" he asked. "When the shelf is shaken by the wind, why do they fall over? Why do they require shaping by my father's hands?" His words pierced the comfort of tradition like arrows, despite his small voice. Abraham's mother kept him quiet out of concern for the rage such thoughts might arouse, but his heart would not stop. He felt that the stars above the plains were more accurate than the statues arranged in rows, their beauty unattainable by human hands and their light unchanging. He felt the stirring of something bigger, something invisible yet alive, as he lay awake at night and gazed out into space. The clang of metal, the scent of spices, and the chants of priests calling the populace to worship the sun, moon, and storm gods filled Ur's marketplace. Abraham walked among them and observed men bending low with their foreheads pressed to the ground in front of statues. Like a tide, he felt the weight of the crowd's beliefs bearing down on him, but he also felt isolated from it because of the light flickering inside his soul. He observed kids his age bowing next to their parents while repeating incomprehensible words, and he pondered why none of them questioned what so strongly agitated him. How could stone possess the power of the heavens? How was it possible for clay to reveal life's secrets? Abraham stood in front of the rows of figures his father had carved one evening as the idol shop's lamps were lit and the shadows grew longer. They had gold-encrusted forms and brightly painted faces, but they felt cold to the touch. He had a bold, unwavering thought. If these were gods, they must be able to defend themselves. He raised a stick and struck the smaller idols, causing their fragile bodies to break against the floor. Abraham experienced clarity instead of fear as dust rose and pieces flew. Then he put the stick in the hand of the biggest idol, the one that stood tallest among the others. His father's eyes widened at the ruin when he returned. "Child, what have you done?" he sobbed. Abraham pointed to the still-standing figure in a composed voice. "I wasn't the one. This was done by the great idol. He broke them because he was upset with the smaller ones." Terah's voice became piercing and his face flushed. "Don't make fun of me, boy. They can't move, you know." And Abraham's scathing yet gentle response hung in the air. "Why do we bow to them if they are immobile, incapable of fighting, and unable to save themselves?" Like sparks in the wind, the words spread. Some chuckled, writing him off as a stupid kid who couldn't comprehend the significance of custom. Others became agitated, uncomfortable with the reality that his words revealed. The priests frowned and murmured about danger because the people's silence was the source of their power, and Abraham's inquiries broke that silence. Even as a young boy, his defiance was steady, like an unquenchable flame, rather than loud or violent. His thoughts rose above the reach of statues and temples as he strolled through the fields outside the city, his eyes searching the sky. He questioned whether the sun was really in charge of the earth when it shone on him during the day. But as evening approached and the sun set, he realized that even the brightest light was constrained by something bigger. Then the moon appeared, silver and huge, but Abraham realized once more that nothing created by cycles and shadows could last forever when clouds covered its face. Beyond the sun, moon, and stars, he felt the presence of an invisible force that illuminated everything while never going out. This restless searching was incomprehensible to the people. They believed that there were numerous gods, each of whom was responsible for a particular aspect of life and was obligated to perform sacrifices and rituals. However, Abraham's heart told him that the power that created the earth and stretched the heavens had to be one, and that truth could not be separated. Despite his youth, he had a spirit that was stronger than age. He was unaffected by his playmates' laughter or the elders' reprimands. He experienced a sense of closeness in his dreams, as though the real Creator spoke to him in a voice that evoked wonder and harmony rather than using human words. On some evenings, he scaled his father's house's roof and sat by himself under the stars. Above him, the heavens were open and undisturbed, while the world below was filled with chants and prayers to idols. The stars appeared to be living beings, not gods in and of themselves, but observers of a higher power that placed them where they were. Even as a young child, Abraham sensed that they were speaking to him through their patterns in the sky, which seemed to be messages intended for anyone who could read them. He spoke in a whisper to the night, not to stone or idols, but to the invisible one he knew had to be there. "If you are there, show me," he said in a shaky, unsure but hopeful voice. Abraham felt a quiet response, a warmth that spread like dawn in his chest, even though there was no fire burning on the ground or a voice thundering from the heavens. Abraham's heart had started to awaken to a different path, even though the idols in the shop were still dead and the priests were still calling on their numerous gods. The light within him came from a truth that transcended human grasp, not from stone or custom. Even though he was still a boy, the seeds of a journey that would take him far from and idols and into a covenant that the world would remember long after the statues in his father's shop had crumbled were sparked inside of him. Those around him shook their heads, but that light did not waver. They only saw a child, but inside that child was a vision that extended beyond the stars themselves, beyond the plains where towers rose, and beyond the rivers of his native land. For now, in his youth, he merely carried the light of a truth that would not be silenced, a flame that flickered softly against the darkness of stone. The boy who questioned idols would grow up to be the man who walked with the invisible God. The sound of voices, the clang of metal on stone, and the scent of incense wafting through the air filled the marketplace. The temple towered over the city center, brimming with idols of all sizes and shapes, their painted faces illuminated by oil lamps. These characters stood in for the protectors of war, the bringers of harvest, and the givers of rain to the people of Before them, both men and women bowed low, begging for blessings, offering gifts, and whispering prayers. Abraham, however, stood in the middle of all this devotion, silent but agitated, his gaze following the motionless faces of the gods his people worshipped. Never once had he seen them move or speak, even though he had witnessed them being carved by human hands, lysis, lifted into position by ropes and strength, and polished until they gleamed. He couldn't stop the question from whispering in his heart. How could these dead statues govern the earth and the heavens? Because his father, Terah, was an idol maker, Abraham had been surrounded by idols growing up. Wooden and stone figures, some tall, some small enough to fit in a hand, lined the shelves of his home. He had played with them as a kid, touching their faces and observing patrons bowing before them as if they were real. But the uneasiness in his heart grew with him. Abraham stood by himself among the rows of idols one evening after the shop had closed and the clamor of the city had subsided into the night. He was met with the blank, blind stares of their painted eyes. He extended his hand and touched one of them, but all he felt was the cold stone. He spoke in a low, nearly whispery voice. "Why don't you speak if you are gods? Why don't you move?" There was silence and no response. No sound could overpower the silence. His hand finally clenched into a fist as it filled the room and pressed against his thoughts. He picked up a stick that was lying around and threw it at the smallest idol. It broke apart, pieces falling all over the floor. His heart ached from the realization of what he had done, not from fear. Another fell as he struck again. His blows caused the figures to shatter one by one, their faces disintegrating and their bodies turning to dust. When he was finally done, there was only one idol left, and it was the biggest one, standing taller than the others. Abraham, as if to tell a tale that could only be told in silence, put the very stick he had used into its hand. Then he took a step back, panting, encircled by the ruins of the gods his people had worshipped. Terah's voice thundered with anger when he returned and saw the devastation. "My son, what have you done?" He sobbed as he reached for the broken pieces, his hands shaking. Abraham pointed to the massive idol that was still standing, composed and steady. "It wasn't me," he stated. "This was done by the powerful one." He became envious and ruined the others. Terah yelled, "Don't lie to me," as his rage flared. "These are immobile, you know." Abraham's silent words then sliced through the atmosphere like a blade. "Why do you worship them if they are immobile and unable to defend themselves?" The ensuing quiet was as heavy as stone. Terah was unable to respond because his own voice had revealed the gods he had carved to be lifeless. The news quickly got out. Abraham was ridiculed by some as a careless, naive, and conceited boy. Others, troubled by the truth his actions exposed, whispered uneasily. The priests became enraged because his disobedience jeopardized their authority over the populace. With their robes sweeping the floor, they assembled and called for Abraham to be punished. Abraham, however, did not shudder in their presence. He spoke words that seemed too powerful for someone so young, and he stood in their courts with unwavering eyes. "These idols you worship are worthless. They are unable to hear you, respond to you, or save you. The earth and heavens are ruled by a single person who is the source of all life and vitality." He said, "You should serve him alone." His steady, low voice moved the listeners. It was too much for the leaders to handle. They were incensed because he had revealed their hollowness, in addition to disobeying their customs. In order to stop his voice from spreading further, they made the decision to destroy him. Flames roared high in a prepared pit, so fierce that those who fed it had to retreat from its heat. Abraham was carried forward in chains, but his spirit remained unshaken, and his face remained composed. The crowd gathered to observe, anticipating that he would be enthralled in a matter of seconds. However, he was unaffected by the leaping and crackling flames. He stood in the middle of the flames, unharmed, as if the creator he had mentioned were walking alongside him. As the crowd gasped, some people fled in amazement, and others fell to their knees in terror. With their chants faltering and their power shattered at the sight of the miracle, the priests were unable to explain it. Abraham emerged from the flames unscathed, his clothing undamaged. The ensuing silence was unlike any other. It was the silence of men devoid of their illusions, not the silence of stone. After that, no one dared to touch him, because they had personally witnessed the existence of the power he described. Abraham had discovered a living God, one who responded with presence and protection rather than painted eyes or carved lips, while the idols stood silent in their temples. Although the road ahead was unclear, he had no doubt in his heart. In addition to being an act of rebellion, the breaking of the idols marked the start of a journey, a new path that would take him out of Ur and into the unknown, led by the invisible hand that had saved him from the flames. As the days went by, Abraham's perception of his native land changed as he strolled through its streets. The lofty temples now appeared hollow rather than powerful. The priests' chants echoed emptiness instead of power. Even the largest of the idols was made of stone. Abraham carried the light of truth, one God, invisible yet alive, eternal and sovereign, in the silence of his heart. Now, the boy who had broken idols was walking in search of a path that no one else could comprehend. Abraham turned his face toward the sky, knowing that a living voice, ready to summon him into a destiny far greater than the ruins left in his father's shop. waited beyond the silence of stone, while the people continued to bow before their gods. There was a sense of a live silence in the night, as if the air itself were listening. Abraham's eyes were fixed on the sky as he sat away from the bustle of the city. Above him, the heavens were a vast expanse of black canvas covered in innumerable stars. As if each light held a message too great for words, they glowed with a brilliance that roused something deep inside him. He had long sensed the hollowness of idols and the death of artificial gods, but in this silence, his heart felt a presence he had never experienced before. Instead of just shining, the stars appeared to whisper, their light combining to form a voice that extended beyond the boundaries of the planet. As Abraham listened, his breath caught because he sensed a call, a stirring that spoke to his soul rather than just his ears within that silent radiance. It started with a straightforward but profound order. Leave your nation, your family, and your father's home. Set out for a land that I will show you, leaving behind the life you have always known. Abraham's heart shook because leaving behind one's roots, the land where generations had lived, and the bonds that held him to family and custom was no small matter. However, the call from above was unmistakably authoritative and gentle all at once. The command was accompanied by a promise as big as the night sky. I'll turn you into a great country. Your name will be remembered, and you will receive my blessing. All of the earth's families will receive blessings through you. Abraham gazed once more at the innumerable and immeasurable stars, and although he was unable to comprehend how such a thing could exist, his heart was full of faith. The Eternal's voice gave certainty to the uncertain path in front of him. Abraham realized that his life would never be the same as he stood up from the ground, his eyes still raised to the sky. The priests of idols murmured that he had been misled, his neighbors ridiculed his faith, and his family questioned his choice. Abraham, however, did not falter. He assembled his flocks, his household, and those who were willing to follow him, and he set out on the promise-driven, mapeless road. Even though he had no land of his own and no powerful tribe by his side, he walked as if the stars themselves had marked his path, which led him farther away from the familiar and closer to faith with each step. It was a long journey across plains, rivers, hills, and valleys. The call from the heavens persisted despite the shifting terrain beneath his feet. His camp was occasionally pressed by hunger, and at other times there was a constant fear of raiders. On cold nights in the wilderness, the fire in his camp seemed insufficient to chase the darkness away. However, when Abraham looked up, the stars continued to shine, and the promise whispered once more, "I am with you." It was a much greater blessing, the presence of the one who created the stars themselves, than the kind of blessing men sought from idols tied to rain or crops. As the years went by, Abraham's heart ached with an unmet desire, even though he was wealthy and had herds. Because his tent was silent and he had no child to bear his name, even though the voice had promised descendants as numerous as the stars. Sarah's face became wrinkled with age every year, and the hope of children seemed to wane like the last remnants of a dying fire. However, the voice reappeared one night when Abraham was once more standing beneath the sky, unflinching and unaffected by the passing of time. "If you can count stars, look up at the sky and do so." Abraham raised his eyes, his chest rising with a breath of awe, and his heart was full even though his arms were empty. "So shall your descendants be." Because the one who spoke was incredibly faithful, he found peace in his belief. Signs that united heaven and earth strengthened the covenant. Abraham witnessed the eternal move between split pieces of sacrifice and visions of fire and smoke, completing a promise made by God himself rather than by humans. It was a promise of land and heritage, a connection that extended well beyond his own life into future generations. Abraham knelt in wonder because this was a divine promise woven into the very fabric of creation, not a dream of human ambition. As if they witnessed the sealing of the covenant, the stars above appeared to burn brighter. However, the wait was lengthy and Sarah felt the pressure of hope. In her desire, she presented Abraham with her servant Hagar, thinking that maybe another would fulfill the promise. Abraham cherished Ishmael, the newborn child. However, the voice from heaven returned, this time with clarity and unwavering determination. Sarah herself would be the conduit for the promise, not someone else's line. Abraham was shocked and incredulous. How could a woman so old and long barren have a child? "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" the Eternal asked, speaking with the authority of creation itself. The covenant was identified by a sign that was engraved into Abraham's family's very flesh, in addition to a promise. As a tangible reminder of the invisible connection between Abraham's line and the Eternal, circumcision came to symbolize belonging. It was a trust-based covenant of faith that was upheld by the body. Because Abraham had discovered that the voice calling him from his homeland was never silent in its faithfulness, he obeyed even when the command appeared challenging. One evening, Sarah was sitting next to Abraham under the stars when she let out a soft laugh. The promise that she would have a son had been reiterated to her, and although the ridiculousness of it made her heart tremble, the laugh was one of wonder, as well as doubt. Could it be that happiness was finally approaching after all the years of waiting and emptiness? Abraham understood that the covenant was about more than just land or descendants. It was about a relationship with the Eternal, a bond of trust that passed beyond human boundaries. The heavens whispered still, their light gentle but unwavering. The stars were silent witnesses to the covenant that molded Abraham's life, even as the seasons changed and his household's tents moved around. He would never forget the first night when he was called to abandon everything by a whisper from the heavens that pierced the earth's silence. That night served as a constant reminder to him that faith is a journey that starts with trust in the invisible rather than with certainty of sight. The stars were promises woven into the sky, each echoing the covenant that bound Abraham to the Creator of everything, rather than being far-off points of light. Beneath the night sky, the sands of the desert stretched endlessly in silence. The cool breeze brushed Abraham's face as he sat by himself outside his tent, the weight of years' worth of promises still pressing down on his heart. He recalled the first summons, the voice that commanded him to leave his homeland and travel toward an unknown land. Not from men or idols, but from the Eternal himself. In addition to calling him away from the life he had known, that voice had encased him in promises and words that were much bigger than his own years. It was a covenant, a holy tie that seemed to have been inscribed in the heavens themselves, rather than a transient guarantee. Abraham was repeatedly reminded by the Eternal in ways that etched themselves deeply into his spirit that his word was not like human words, which are brittle and prone to breaking, but rather eternal and stable like the stars that illuminate the night. Although there were no promising children in his household, he had vowed to turn Abraham into a great nation. He had promised to bless him and spread his name so that future generations would remember him. Furthermore, as if the quiet life of a man who had given up everything to follow a voice were shaping the fate of nations, he had promised that Abraham would bring blessings to all the families on earth. Despite his occasional fatigue, Abraham believed, and his faith was regarded as righteousness, a beacon of light during his wanderings. When the sky revealed its innumerable lights and the air was still one night, the Eternal led Abraham outside his tent and instructed him to raise his gaze to the sky. Abraham looked up at the endless canopy that glittered above him as he said, "Count the stars if you can." The voice went on, "So shall your descendants be." Abraham stood silently, breathing deeply as his chest rose, for just as the promise was incalculable, so was the sky above. The Eternal spoke with the authority of creation itself, and Abraham's heart clung to that word as if it were life, despite Sarah's infertility and the pressure of age on both of them. The covenant was irrevocably sealed. As was customary in ancient covenants, Abraham was told to divide the animals and prepare a sacrifice. He did as he was told, putting the pieces in place, and as night fell, he fell into a deep sleep. Abraham saw a vision in the midst of the darkness that enveloped the land, a blazing torch and a smoking fire pot moving between the fragmented pieces. The Eternal himself was taking an oath, relying on his own unwavering will, rather than Abraham's strength. The promise was now a legally binding covenant that was unbreakable and recorded for all time, rather than just a word spoken in passing. As time passed, the strain of waiting put Abraham's faith to the test. Ishmael was born as a result of Sarah's offer of her maidservant Hagar, who was filled with longing and despair. Despite Abraham's love for the child, the Eternal made it clear that Sarah, not Ishmael, would fulfill the covenant promise. The promise went against all natural expectations because it was impossible for a woman who was so old to have a son. But the Eternal's word did not waver, and he repeated, "I will bless Sarah, and she shall give rise to nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her." Abraham collapsed, caught between awe and the impossibility of such a hope. But the Eternal's voice remained unwavering. His promise was unconstrained by human limitations. A sign was placed on Abraham and his family to signify the covenant. As a tangible symbol of the invisible connection between the Eternal and his chosen, every male was to be circumcised. It served as a physical reminder that Abraham and his offspring were descended from the Creator of the heavens. Abraham obeyed the Eternal's voice despite the difficulty of the command because he had discovered that doing so led to blessings that no idol or human hand could bestow. Abraham's line was chosen by God to carry a promise that would eventually reach the world, and the pact was not just about descendants and land, but also about relationships. As the years went by, the Eternal's prediction came to pass. 3 men in appearance, but with the weight of heaven in their presence, visitors arrived at Abraham's tent by the oaks of Mamre. They talked to him, they ate with him, and they said again that Sarah would have a son. Although Sarah chuckled to herself that it was impossible, the guests questioned, "Is anything too difficult for the Lord?" The moment became ingrained in their memories since it was more than just a visit. Rather, it was a confirmation of the unending promise. When Isaac was eventually born, Abraham's tent was filled with laughter. Not doubtful laughter, but joyful laughter. The child's cry was more than just the sound of fresh life. It was the tangible evidence that the Eternal's word could rekindle life where none had existed for years. Abraham knew he was holding the beginning of a promise that extended beyond the horizon when he held the child in his arms. Because they had been the first to witness the covenant, and now its fulfillment was starting to take shape. The stars above seemed to shine brighter during that season. However, there were challenges to the covenant. Abraham was asked to bring Isaac to the mountain and present him as a sacrifice by the Eternal, who had given birth to the son of promise. Abraham's heart ached from the weight of the command, but he got up early and followed it because he believed that the one who had made the promise would be able to keep it even after he died. Abraham was holding a knife on the mountain when the voice from heaven halted him once more, urging him not to hurt the boy. The covenant was reaffirmed there with even more force. "Because you have not withheld your son, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand on the seashore." Abraham named the place, "The Lord will provide," and provided a ram in Isaac's place. The Anisiaios. Agreement was eternal, recorded not on parchment, but in the very order of creation. The promise given to Abraham would endure despite the rise and fall of generations. With his own word, an oath that endured through time, the Eternal had bound himself. Abraham's tent would eventually give way to nations, and his name would be remembered for faith in an unfailing voice rather than for earthly strength. The covenant opened a way for the world to learn about the Eternal, and it was more than just a blessing for one family. The promise was written in the heavens, gleaming in each star and resonating in the stillness of the night sky, rather than being limited to the earth. Abraham lived a nomadic life, but his narrative was rooted in a word that transcended his physical boundaries, a word that was timeless, unwavering, and eternal. With the gentle glow of light grazing the horizon, the morning arrived in silence. Abraham got up before the camp shifted, his face serene but his heart heavy. The words that the Eternal had spoken to him had been more piercing than any previous command. He was instructed to bring his beloved son, Isaac, the child of promise and the source of his old age's laughter, to the mountain and present him there as a burnt offering. Because Isaac was not only his son, but also the living embodiment of the covenant, the one through whom the Eternal had vowed to create nations, the command weighed heavily on his chest. Abraham, however, did not argue because he had discovered via years of wandering that following the Eternal was always worthwhile, even if the journey seemed insurmountable. He gathered 2 of his servants, saddled his donkey, and woke Isaac gently. Unaware of the command that hovered between them like a shadow, the boy's eyes still had the innocence of youth. With every blow of the axe, Abraham's inner struggle was echoed as he split wood for the sacrifice. With Isaac walking beside his father, his steps light and inquisitive, and the donkey bearing the weight of the supplies, the journey started in silence. The servants trailed behind, silently observing as if they could feel the seriousness of the path they were taking. Only the gentle crunch of their feet on the ground broke the stillness of the desert and the stillness of the air. As the sun rose and set over the course of their 3-day journey, Abraham was forced to confront the conflict between his faith in the Eternal and his love for his son. When Abraham looked up on the 3rd day, he saw the location far away, a mountain rising solemnly against the sky. Despite his tightening heart, he turned to his servants and instructed them to stay behind with the donkey. With a steady voice despite his shaking spirit, he said, "The boy and I will go over there to worship, and then we will return to you." The words carried more than just politeness. They carried a secret faith that he and the boy would return in some way, in ways that were invisible. As he carried the knife and the fire, Abraham placed the wood on Isaac's shoulders. Father and son, they ascended together, and there was a long pause before Isaac spoke. His voice was soft and full of trusting innocence. He said, "My father," to which Abraham replied, "Here I am, my son." Isaac turned to face the fire and the wood and inquired, "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" While Abraham's heart ached, he responded calmly, saying, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Isaac accepted the response, and the 2 of them continued walking together, Isaac's shoulders bearing the weight of the wood and Abraham's heart bearing the weight of the sacrifice. Finally, they arrived at the summit of the mountain. With his own hands, Abraham constructed the altar, carefully stacking stone after stone, as if each one symbolized both grief and obedience. He placed the wood on the altar, while the fire waited in its holder in silence. The test finally pressed into bone and flesh. Although there is no sound in the text, it is possible to picture the boy's wide eyes meeting his father's serious gaze as Abraham turned to face Isaac. Abraham placed his son on the altar, on top of the wood he had carried, after binding him with a firm but gentle rope. The mountain was quiet, the air was still, and the sky above appeared to be holding its breath. Abraham took the knife and extended his hand. The weight of obedience pushed him to the brink of unimaginable surrender, and his arm rose, shaky but determined. The Eternal asked for Isaac's life, even though he had promised that the covenant would be upheld through Isaac. Abraham's mind held fast to the invisible, thinking that even if Isaac were killed, the Eternal could bring him back to life because his word could not be broken. A voice, clear, urgent, and powerful, broke the silence as the moment hung in midair, a heartbeat from sacrifice. "Abraham, Abraham." The voice called again, "Do not lay your hand on the boy, for I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." The old man froze, his arm still raised, and replied, "Here I am." Abraham's soul was filled with relief as his trembling hand lowered the knife and his breath broke as if he had been freed from chains. When he looked up, he saw a ram trapped by its horns in the thicket. Abraham went and offered the ram in lieu of his son, his vision blurred by tears. Abraham gave the location the name "The Lord Will Provide" because, where despair had threatened, provision was given on that mountain. The smoke from the sacrifice rose softly into the sky. Beside him, unbound and unhurt, Isaac watched as the fire consumed another in his place. Together, father and son walked down the mountain, their pace slower, their relationship strengthened by the silence they had experienced. However, the test revealed more promise than relief. This time, the voice from heaven was a blessing rather than a command. "I will undoubtedly bless you because you did this, and did not deny your only son. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in heaven and the sand on the beach, and your children will own the gates of their adversaries. All the nations of the world will be blessed through your seed, because you have heeded my voice." The covenant, which had previously been made, was now sealed in a way that could not be broken by trial. It was a bond that was not only inscribed on the stars, but was also engraved on Abraham's obedience, as demonstrated on the mountain where faith and silence came together. The return trip was more subdued, but it was full of unspoken appreciation. Isaac walked next to his father, his trust strengthened rather than shattered, bearing the memory of the altar and the rope. Despite his weariness, Abraham's eyes reflected the image of a man who had witnessed both the brink of destruction and the hand of salvation in one breath. Unaware of the trial that had occurred above them, the servants who had been waiting at the base of the mow, Untain watched as the two returned. However, Abraham felt as though the mountain had permanently altered the air around him. The tale of that mountain persisted throughout the generations and was not limited to Abraham's life. When it seemed impossible to give up, the ram became a symbol of the Eternal's provision, mercy, and substitution. The location's name served as a reminder that the Eternal never forgets or tests without a reason. Every rock on that mountain and every breath in that hallowed silence attested to the indisputable fact that faith and obedience open doors to promises much bigger than human strength can contain. At the end of Abraham's journey of surrender, he had discovered not loss but provision, blessing rather than despair, and a covenant that would last forever instead of silence. The story of Isaac starts with the gentle fulfillment of promises made long before he was born, not with the clash of kingdoms or the roar of great battles. He was the son of laughter because his name echoed the happiness that had filled Sarah's tent when she held him to her chest in her later years. Isaac was more than just a child to Abraham and Sarah. He was the covenant's living embodiment and the evidence that the Eternal's word is always true. Isaac's life unfolded with a gentler rhythm than his father's, which had been filled with restless travels, altars constructed in various places, and trials on mountains. Through his quiet life, the blessings promised to his father started to materialize. His story was not one of conquest, but rather of roots and dwelling rather than wandering. Isaac was reminded of God's promise from an early age. He was weaned in the midst of a feast and celebration, drawing many people to see the child who shouldn't have been born. However, tensions were still present even in those early years. Hagar's son Ishmael scorned Isaac, and Sarah's protective nature insisted on their separation. Torn between his two sons, Abraham left Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness, believing the Eternal would take care of them as he had promised. Isaac became the only heir in his father's tents as a result, and his position as the covenant bearer remained unaltered. Here, framed not by competition but by the unique fate of continuing what his father had demonstrated under the stars, the quiet of his life began. When Isaac reached adulthood, Abraham had to make a decision that would affect his son's future. He vowed not to take a bride from the Canaanites and sent his servant back to his family's homeland to find Isaac a wife. As the servant traveled with prayer in his heart, he met Rebekah at a well. Her generosity to a stranger and his camels demonstrated that she was the Eternal's chosen one. With her heart open to the unknown journey ahead, she consented to leave her family and journey to a place she had never seen. Lifting his eyes from meditation, Isaac saw her for the first time in the evening while strolling through the fields. Rebekah became both his wife and his partner in the developing covenant after their quiet but meaningful meeting. She went into Sarah's tent, and Isaac found solace in her following the death of his mother, the grief of loss eased by new friendship. Although Isaac did not experience Abraham's restless wandering, he too experienced hardship and famine. When the land became scarce, he traveled to Gerar and met Abimelech, the Philistine king. Isaac was terrified, just as his father had been, and he declared that Rebekah was his sister, lest something bad happen to him for her sake. When the truth was revealed, Abimelech spared him and protected Isaac and his family. Isaac planted crops and received 100-fold return, even in the land of strangers, because he was blessed by the Eternal. The Philistines watched him with envy as his wealth increased, flocks, herds, and servants multiplied. As if to preserve the memory of his father's footsteps, Isaac moved from place to place, reopening Abraham's wells and naming them as before, stopping the wells that his father's servants had dug. Every well had a tale of conflict and harmony. Shepherds fought and strove against him at one point, so he gave it the name Esek because it was a contentious area. Another conflict emerged, which he named Sitnah because it was characterized by resistance. Isaac, however, did not hold on to conflict. Instead, he moved on until he found a place where no one contested with him. He named the well Rehoboth there and declared, "Now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land." His gentleness and patience transformed conflict into peace, and his quiet strength gave his life a different kind of victory. Whereas Jacob would battle angels and Abraham had erected altars, Isaac provided stability and a serene presence that fostered blessing and growth. The covenant was reaffirmed when the Eternal appeared to Isaac in the middle of his prosperity. "I am Abraham's father, God. For the sake of my servant Abraham, do not be alarmed. I am with you and will bless you and multiply your children." Isaac constructed an altar, invoked the name of the Eternal, and set up his tent close by. His family gathered around the well that signified the flow of promise as well as water. After realizing that Isaac was clearly blessed by the Eternal, Abimelech himself came to make amends with him. After sharing a feast and making a covenant, they peacefully parted ways in the morning. As a result, Isaac's life was a blessing to everyone around him, not just his family, bringing strangers together with the silent power of his faith. Isaac's story, however, was filled with both happiness and sorrow inside his tent. Despite being so clearly chosen, Rebekah experienced years of infertility, mirroring Sarah's struggle before her. The Eternal heard Isaac's fervent prayers and gave them twin sons. The conflict between them was predicted even before they were born because the children fought in Rebekah's womb. And the Eternal said that there were two nations, one stronger than the other, and that the elder would serve the younger. The firstborn, Esau, came out red and hairy, a man of strength and a field hunter. In an indication of the striving that would influence their lives, Jacob followed, holding on to his brother's heel. Rebekah loved Jacob because of his quiet demeanor, which reflected his father's gentleness, while Isaac loved Esau because of the wildness of his spirit and the flavor of the game he brought. The strain of conflicted love permeated their home, hinting at the difficulties that would follow. One day, when Esau was hungry, he sold Jacob his birthright for a bowl of stew, hating the sacred for short-term gain. Later, as he grew older and less able to see, Isaac attempted to bless his oldest child, but Rebekah, recalling the Eternal's word, led Jacob to accept the blessing instead. Esau's cries of agony filled the tent as he discovered what had been done, and the younger son inherited what had been predicted through deceit and disguise. Even though his sons were split apart at this point, Isaac's life continued to be a conduit for blessings. The covenant, which was a thread of promise that ran from Abraham to Isaac and then to Jacob, passed through him, not because of his efforts, but rather because of the Eternal's decision. Isaac lived a long life. His days were characterized by loyalty rather than conquest, and his presence served as a constant beacon in the fabric of his family's history. With his flocks growing, his household expanding, and his quiet ways molding a generation that would uphold the covenant, he lived in the land that his father had promised. In order to ensure that the promise would be fulfilled through the family selected by the Eternal rather than by mingling with the surrounding nations, Isaac blessed Jacob once more as his time drew near and sent him to find a wife in the land of his mother's kin. Esau also received a blessing, albeit a different one. Isaac's fatherhood mark was still on him, even though his strength was destined to live apart. Because of Abraham's daring travels and Jacob's restless striving, Isaac's story frequently fades into the background of larger narratives. However, there is a depth to his silence that cannot be ignored. He was the heir who carried on what had been said under the stars, the link that connected promise and fulfillment. His fields still yielded, his tents still stood in peace, his wells still flowed, and his faith, gentle but unwavering, preserved the covenant that would one day embrace nations. Not all heirs of promise need to roar like lions or wrestle like warriors. Some, like Isaac, quietly guard the blessing, keeping it alive through prayer, patience, and the steady rhythm of trust. His life served as a reminder of this. The story of Jacob and Esau started in conflict even before they were born, their fates entwined in a conflict that would eventually shape entire nations. The twins wrestling in the silence of their mother Rebekah's womb was a sign of the lives they would lead. When Rebekah sought the eternal because she was troubled by the intensity of the struggle, she received a message that was unlike any other. She was born with two nations, two peoples, one stronger than the other, and the elder would serve the younger. Even before the boys were born, this revelation cast a shadow of mystery over them, and their family would bear the consequences of this prophecy in all subsequent decisions. Esau was the first to emerge on the day of birth, his body red and hairy, powerful and impressive even as a baby. His father, Isaac, would admire his strength and wildness as he developed into a man of the field, a hunter who flourished in the open wilderness. However, Jacob was born right away, his hand clutching his brother's heel as though he couldn't let go. This small act foreshadowed his life's endeavors, as Jacob would live in pursuit of blessings, inheritance, and destiny rather than physical strength. He was a man of silent tents, a man of stillness, a man of calculation and thought, unlike Esau. Even though they lived together, these two brothers couldn't have been more dissimilar, each representing a different path that caused them to clash. Esau's hunting prowess delighted their father Isaac, who also enjoyed the meat he brought home and the relationship they developed. But Jacob was his mother's favorite son. She loved him for his wisdom and gentleness, and his temperament spoke to her. Within the family, this division of affection planted the seeds of rivalry. The boys' division was exacerbated by the weight of parental favoritism in addition to their differences. Isaac saw the strength and vitality in Esau, but Rebekah recalled what had been said to her before they were born. The younger would rise, even above the elder. As a result, their home was characterized by both love and subdued tension, with a silent struggle of fates taking place among them. Esau came home from the field one day, exhausted and famished. Taking care of a pot of lentil stew, Jacob glanced at his brother and took the opportunity. Hunger-driven, Esau pleaded for the red stew, saying he was on the verge of death. With a cunning plan, Jacob demanded his birthright in return. The firstborn's sacred inheritance, family leadership, covenant blessing, and honor among kin was exchanged for a bowl of food in that one instant. Esau hated his birthright for short-term satisfaction because he was irresponsible with what was eternal. Despite his reserved manner, Jacob displayed the perseverance that would come to define his life by using words and guile to grasp this time instead of his hand. Isaac aged over the years, his strength waning and his eyes growing dimmer. Aware that his time was running out, he summoned Esau and gave him instructions to hunt game and cook so that he could bless him before he passed away. This blessing was more than just words. It was the transmission of authority, divine favor, and covenant promises. Rebekah heard and recalled the prenatal prophecy. What had been predicted for Jacob could not be given to Esau. she quickly devised a scheme, dressing Jacob in Esau's clothes and using goatskin to cover his smooth hands and neck to simulate his brother's hairiness. Rebekah encouraged Jacob to continue, saying that any curse would fall upon her, but Jacob hesitated, afraid of his father's wrath if he was caught. Jacob carried the food into Isaac's tent while speaking in a voice that was both betraying and mingled with the scent of Esau's clothing. Unsure, Isaac reached out to touch his son. The voice was Jacob's, but the hands felt like Esau's. When Isaac finally gave Jacob the blessing, he spoke of plenty, dominion, and divine favor, but he was torn between doubt and faith. The truth struck them all as Esau triumphantly returned from the hunt. Isaac shuddered violently as he realized what had happened, but he was unable to retract the blessing because, once spoken, it was irrevocable. The tent trembled as Esau's cries of agony pierced the atmosphere. He begged his father to grant him a blessing and some inheritance. Weary and broken, Isaac spoke over him of a different destiny, that he would live by his sword, that he would be separated from the earth's abundance, and that even though he would serve his brother, he would eventually be free. Esau became enraged with Jacob from that point on and vowed to murder him after their father's funeral days were over. With deadly seriousness, the battle that started in the womb now spilled into their lives, endangering not just their relationship, but also the covenant line's continued existence. Sensing danger, Rebekah urged Jacob to leave. She told Isaac that she was sending him to her brother Laban in Haran to find a wife from their family. But her words belied the urgency of their escape. Even though he was hurt by what had happened, Isaac gave Jacob another covenant blessing before he left, instructing him to travel to his mother's family instead of taking a Canaanite wife. As a result, Jacob left his house with the blessing he had won, but also the burden of fear, uncertainty, and guilt. When Esau realized that his marriages to Canaanite women had angered his parents, he defied them by looking for a new wife from the family of Abraham's other son, Ishmael, as if to forge his own blessed path separate from Jacob's. His decisions revealed not only disobedience, but also a deep-seated wound, the anguish of being passed over and losing what was rightfully his. Even so, Esau's strength persisted despite his rage, making him a powerful character whose fate would play out partially outside of the covenant, but never completely outside of it. Jacob underwent a metamorphosis during his separation from his brother. He fled Esau's wrath with nothing but his staff, but he carried the blessing that had been spoken with him. Using a stone as a pillow in the stillness of the wilderness, he dreamed of a ladder that extended to the heavens, angels climbing and descending, and the Eternal standing overhead, reaffirming the promises given to Abraham and Isaac. This vision proved that Jacob was the chosen bearer of the covenant in spite of his deceit and fear. His inheritance was certain, but his path would not be simple. In the meantime, Esau's tale persisted in the background, his strength defining a life distinct from Jacob's. He would go on to become the father of the Edomites, a fierce, independent nation that lived in rocky terrain. Even though their paths diverged, the brotherhood bond remained intact despite the strain and scars. Their encounter would show whether hatred remained ferocious or whether peace could be achieved when Jacob returned from his exile years later, terrified of Esau's retaliation. More than just sibling rivalry, the conflict between Jacob and Esau represented the collision of two destinies and the revelation of divine purpose via human weakness. While one brother hated what was sacred for the sake of instant gratification, the other brother cherished the eternal but managed to obtain it by deceit. The family that held the covenant turned into a place of deceit, tears, and striving as a result of their parents' strained love. But despite everything, the blessing persisted, advancing not because of perfection but because of promise, influencing the history of an unborn people. Silence filled the night as Jacob wandered by himself, separated from his family and home, bearing only the burden of his thoughts and the blessing that had been spoken over him. He had departed quickly, escaping his brother Esau's fury, who had vowed to exact revenge on him. He was reminded at every turn on the dusty trail that he was both hunted and chosen, fortunate and uneasy. As the sun set behind the hills, the shadows lengthened until the entire area was dark. He was exhausted, and since there was nowhere to hide but the sky, he found a spot to lie down. Beneath the blanket of stars, he closed his eyes and rested his head on a stone, a firm support for a tired traveler. His spirit opened to something bigger in that silence, in the brittle liminal space between fatigue and slumber. A vision unlike anything he had ever experienced started to take shape as sleep took hold of him. He saw a ladder in front of him, with the top reaching into the sky and the base resting on the ground. It was a clear image, rising far above the stars, linking the infinite space above with the ground beneath his body. Angels rose and fell, figures of glowing light moving in a graceful rhythm along this ladder. He was reminded that the invisible world was alive with purpose by their gentle and majestic presence, which was that of messengers of the eternal. Every motion glistened with tranquility, as if the sky itself had parted to embrace the isolation of a man on the run. The Eternal himself, one greater than all, was standing above the ladder, and his voice pierced the night's stillness. Reminding Jacob of the promises given to his father Isaac and grandfather Abraham, he spoke to him in a way that was both authoritative and consoling. Jacob and his descendants would own the land where he lay. His family would grow to be as numerous and enduring as the dust of the earth, dispersing in all directions. Every family on the planet would benefit from him and his seed. Then came the words, "I am with you," which cut through Jacob's anxiety. "Wherever you go, I'll be with you. I'll return you to this country. Until I fulfill my promise, I won't abandon you." Like a soft river coursing through a dry land, the sound of those words filled Jacob's heart. Now he knew he was not abandoned, even though he had left home empty-handed, filled with fear and guilt. The wilderness surrounding him was no longer desolate, but rather teeming with the presence of God, and the stone beneath his head was transformed into a sacred resting place. In the silence of that night, Jacob learned that the Eternal was nearer than his own breath, watching, directing, and tying his life into a larger narrative, and that heaven and earth were not as far apart as they appeared to be. The vision weighed heavily on Jacob's soul when he woke up from his dream. With the morning light barely peeking over the horizon, he sat up and looked around the serene landscape. He was consumed by the memory of the ladder, the angels, and the Eternal's voice. "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it," he whispered to himself, trembling. A feeling of awe overcame him, and he proclaimed the ground holy. The wilderness had been transformed into a haven where heaven and earth had met. In devotion, he poured oil over the stone he had used as a pillow and placed it upright as a pillar. He gave the location the name Bethel, which means house of God, so that it would always serve as a reminder of the night that eternity bowed down to meet him. In addition to providing him with a glimpse of heaven, the dream had calmed his inner turmoil. Jacob's heart had been troubled before that night, divided between fearing his brother's wrath and feeling guilty for his deceit. All he had left was doubt, but in that dream, he was given identity and destiny, not just assurance. The Eternal himself's voice sealed his father's blessing, which was no longer merely a statement. Jacob was now aware that his journey was one of promise rather than just a run from peril. The latter image was still etched in his mind as he got up and carried on. His heart was steady with the knowledge that he was never alone, and he walked with a newfound calm, his steps lighter than before. The angel's ascent and descent came to represent the invisible concern that enveloped him. The heavens were open and the Eternal's hand was close by, even in the remoteness of the wilderness. A night of uncertainty and terror had given way to one of hope and tranquility. He was reminded of that voice that had spoken in the dream by every sound of the desert wind. The distant cries of birds, the whisper of grass, and the rustle of leaves all appeared to reverberate with the words of divine assurance. "I'll accompany you. I won't abandon you." These words turned into his song, a lulling tune that comforted him as he continued his journey. He was a chosen vessel bearing a covenant that extended beyond himself. He was no longer merely a runaway fleeing his brother's wrath. More than just a vision, the ladder that linked the earth and heavens was a relationship revelation. Now Jacob realized that the Eternal was not far away, perched far above human hardships. He was close by, his messengers traveling between worlds and his presence directing the lives of those he summoned. A moment of rest was granted to Jacob, a man who had lived by cunning and hard work, serving as a gentle reminder that destiny was something to be received rather than something to be grabbed. Through the grace of a God who vowed to stick by him, the battle that had started in his mother's womb and had led him into deceit and fear was now balanced. The blessing of Isaac and the recollection of that peaceful night under the stars accompanied Jacob as the days passed. He thought of the ladder every time fear threatened to rise. He thought of the angels whenever he felt lonely. He recalled the voice that vowed to never abandon him whenever doubt murmured in his heart. Each memory led him forward steadily and gently, like a light in the dark. The dream had calmed him, even though he was journeying in a faraway land toward an uncertain future. It served as a reminder that he could still come into contact with the Eternal in the middle of nowhere, with nothing more than a stone under his head. Despite the difficulties, lies, and trials that lay ahead, the memory of that night would continue to be a source of strength. With the quiet assurance of someone who had witnessed heaven open and heard the Eternal's voice speaking directly into his life, Jacob would face his difficulties. Thus, Jacob began his journey with the first rays of dawn on his face and the latter vision still fresh in his mind. His heart was calm despite the vastness and uncertainty of the wilderness that lay before him, because he had found the comfort of knowing that he was in hands far bigger than his own during a single night of sleep, in a dream in which angels moved between the earth and the sky. The story of Joseph starts in the fields of Canaan, where he was Jacob's cherished son. He was clad in a multicolored coat, a gift that symbolized his father's intense love in addition to being beautiful. His dreams with the sun, moon, and stars bowing to him and wheat sheaves bending before his own were as distinctive as this coat. While his brothers were envious and resentful, Joseph saw these dreams as mysteries full of wonder. Even though his remarks were innocent, they fueled their resentment because they felt that the younger brother, who appeared to be destined for greatness, was more important than them. What started out as quiet complaining quickly evolved into a scheme that would change their entire lives as jealousy turned to rage. They saw Joseph coming from a distance one day when he was sent to look for his brothers in the fields, his coat colors gleaming in the sunlight. Envy filled their hearts, and they discussed taking his life among themselves. However, Reuben, their eldest brother, persuaded them to cast him into a pit rather than spill blood in the hopes of saving him later. Joseph's cries reverberated against the walls of the dark, dry, and empty pit, while his brothers gazed down in indifference. A group of traders arrived on the road while Reuben was away, their camels laden with spices that were headed for Egypt. The brothers seized the opportunity, dragged Joseph out of the pit, and sold him to the travelers for silver. They brought Joseph's coat to their father, who sobbed bitterly because he thought his beloved son had been ripped apart by a ferocious animal and stained it with goat's blood as the caravan vanished into the distance. Silence and grief characterized Joseph's journey into Egypt, but a light that would not go out remained within him. He had faith in the God of his fathers despite being betrayed and abandoned. Joseph worked diligently and honorably after being sold as a servant into the home of Potiphar, a Pharaoh's officer. Everything he touched prospered because his hands and heart were steady. When Potiphar realized this, he gave him control over his household and placed everything in his care. However, shadows persisted even in this position of accountability. Joseph resisted Potiphar's wife's attempts to persuade him to sin in order to honor his God and his master. She pressed him day after day, until one day, when he escaped from her grasp, she falsely accused him while grabbing his garment. Her remarks were taken seriously, and Potiphar imprisoned Joseph despite possibly not knowing the whole truth. Joseph found favor even in the gloomy and restrictive prison. The prison guard quickly saw the wisdom in him and assigned him to watch over the other inmates. Joseph's talent for dream interpretation developed within those chilly stone walls. The cupbearer and the baker, two of Pharaoh's servants who were imprisoned with him, both suffered from incomprehensible dreams. With patience, Joseph explained the meaning. The baker would die, but the cupbearer would be put back in his place. His words were followed exactly. But despite Joseph's request that the cupbearer remember him, days passed into years and his name was forgotten in the halls of power. Nevertheless, Joseph persisted, waiting in silent trust, understanding that only God had control over time and fate. Then one night the Pharaoh himself was troubled by dreams, visions of healthy grain stalks being swallowed by withered ones and fat cows being eaten by lean ones. The cupbearer, finally recalling Joseph, mentioned the Hebrew youth who could decipher dreams after none of Egypt's wise men were able to solve the mystery. Joseph was called out of prison and stood before Pharaoh, confident but humble, saying that God, not himself, was the source of the meaning. According to him, the dreams predicted 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of starvation. In order to preserve the country during the lean years, Joseph, who was wise beyond his years, suggested that Pharaoh designate a wise man to store grain during the abundant years. Pharaoh elevated Joseph from prisoner to governor, making him his second in command after being impressed by the spirit within him and the clarity of his words. When the years of plenty arrived, Egypt amassed enormous grain reserves under Joseph's watchful eye. The land flourished and the storehouses grew to capacity. After that, there was a severe and unforgiving famine that affected not just Egypt, but the entire region, and people from all over the world came to buy grain. They included Joseph's own brothers, who were traveling from Canaan in despair. Unaware that the governor was the same brother they had betrayed, they stood before him and bowed low. Joseph instantly recognized them, but he kept his identity a secret to try their hearts. He sought to see if their hearts had changed, even as the pain of their betrayal stirred inside him as he recalled the dreams of his youth, now playing out before his eyes. He interrogated them, charged them with espionage, and insisted that they bring Benjamin, their youngest brother, as evidence of their sincerity. They reluctantly went back home and convinced their father Jacob to release Benjamin because they were under a lot of pressure from the famine. The sight of his full brother warmed Joseph's heart when they returned to Egypt with Benjamin. He made them a feast and watched intently as they took care of each other. He put his silver cup in Benjamin's sack and accused him of stealing it, but he still put them to the test again. Fearful, the brothers volunteered to take Benjamin's place, displaying the solidarity and selflessness that had been lacking for years. Joseph was unable to control himself at that point. As he disclosed who he was, his eyes welled with tears and his voice cracked. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." They were overcome with shock and terror, but Joseph calmed their shaking hearts with kindness. He advised them not to mourn or feel bad about themselves because God had used their intended harm to save many lives during the famine. He wept as he embraced his words, which were ones of reconciliation rather than retaliation. The family was reunited after the anguish of betrayal was replaced by the healing of forgiveness. After learning that Joseph was still alive, Jacob found it hard to believe it until he saw the wagons that had been sent from Egypt. He set out to see his son again after his heart returned to normal. After being apart for so long, the father and son clung to one another during the emotional and tearful reunion. After that, Joseph relocated his family to the land of Goshen, where they were protected by him for the duration of the famine. Joseph's life had been a journey of grief and hope, of waiting and fulfillment, from the pit to the prison, from betrayal to honor. Nevertheless, his story was replete with faith, patience, and the gentle reminder that God's hand was always there, guiding everything toward a higher purpose, even during the darkest times. The children of Israel, living under the yoke of slavery, endured long and arduous nights in Egypt, their hearts aching for freedom and their bodies exhausted from the burdens imposed upon them. During the day, they toiled in the blazing sun, constructing cities and monuments that were not their own, their backs hunched under the weight of harsh demands and their hands raw from shaping clay and straw bricks. Their groans and hushed prayers reached the heavens at night when the land was silent. Their suffering was most audible during these hours, when taskmasters' clamor subsided and the fields were motionless. The aching rhythm of voices raised in the hope that one day the God of their fathers would remember them filled the nighttime silence of Egypt, not with tranquility, but with longing. Many generations had gone by since Joseph's time, when his family in Egypt had been protected by his favor. A new pharaoh had emerged, one who had no recollection of Joseph and showed no concern for his subjects, and the recollection of that season had faded. He believed that the children of Israel posed a threat because they were too numerous and too resilient. He tried to erode their strength through oppression and brutal labor, turning fear into cruelty. However, despite their suffering, they proliferated, spreading like seeds in rich soil. Pharaoh's fear was only heightened by this, and his decree became even more sinister. All male Hebrew children were to be cast into the Nile. In silence, mothers cried while holding their babies close and fervently praying that their sons would be spared. Lullabies became cries, and the air was heavy with grief too profound for words as the nights devolved into a place of mourning. But faith glowed like a tiny flame even in the midst of despair. The elders reminded the populace of the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that they would inherit their own land and that their descendants would number as many as the stars. Children were whispered stories about the covenant around fires that were dimmed by fear, a tenuous thread that bound them to hope. The same God who had guided their fathers would not forget them, they recalled in the silence as their eyes looked to the sky for solace. Even though their chains shook during the day, their spirits rose during the night as they prayed, each sigh serving as a testament to their perseverance and each word as an appeal for salvation. While the Egyptians slept peacefully in their palaces and fortified houses, the Hebrews' minds were racing all night long. Women prayed for their children's safety while rocking them. Men with aching bodies and blistered hands prayed for courage to work another day. The collective scream of a people moaning under oppression, a cry that reverberated beyond human ears and into the heavens, filled the silence, making it anything but empty. The God of their fathers was listening, even though it appeared for a while that their prayers had been lost in the shadows. The burden of bondage only increased as the years stretched into decades, but their prayers also became more intense. Their faith became their weapon and their cries their shield, despite the fact that they lacked an army to overthrow Pharaoh and weapons to combat their masters. The silence of the night became a meeting place between a broken people and their unseen deliverer. There were nights when the stars glistened above the desert sky, and the Hebrews looked up, seeing in their radiance a reminder of the promise given to Abraham that his offspring would number as many as the stars. Unwavering and eternal, those stars became silent witnesses to their suffering and hope. Little deeds of bravery also occurred in the silence of Egypt's nights. Despite being ordered to kill the Hebrews' newborn sons, midwives found ways to preserve life because they feared God more than Pharaoh. Mothers trusted their children to God's invisible hand, as demonstrated by the woman who hid her infant in a basket amidst the Nile's reeds, believing that deliverance might arrive in ways they were not yet able to comprehend. Secrets of bravery, love, and sacrifice were concealed in the quiet of those nights and subtly interwoven with the greater narrative of suffering. Just beyond, the Hebrews' huts stood in sharp contrast, their walls weathered and their tables bare, while Pharaoh's palaces shone in the moonlight, his halls crowded with feasts and laughter. But in those modest houses, voices rose in unison, not to earthly rulers, but to the one who had once guided their fathers with a promise at night and a cloud by day. They thought, albeit dimly at times, that the quiet was a period of waiting rather than desertion. Children's earliest memories were influenced by the sound of whispered hope as they listened to their parents' sighs and learned the language of prayer and longing. Egypt's nighttime quiet was characterized by both preparation and anguish. The threads of their deliverance were already being woven, but the tired slaves could not see or understand it. One day, a child raised in the pharaoh's own home after being rescued from the Nile would hear their cries and tell their tale. They only believed that God was close, even when he was hidden during those nights of suffering, so they were unable to see the result yet. Every night was an endurance test, a silent act of trust that freedom might dawn tomorrow. The night was sacred and heavy to the Hebrews. It was a time when their hearts were free to speak, when the sound of labor had finally subsided, and when they could finally relax. Their prayers became stronger in the silence, rising like incense, invisible yet potent. The groaning of a people, the echo of promises, and the first stirrings of deliverance were all contained within the silence, which was not really silent. In reality, what appeared to be an endless waiting period was the formation of a nation, its identity forged in the furnace of suffering, and its faith put to the test under the stars of Egypt. They persevered through innumerable nights, each one characterized by hope and longing. They raised their voices into the silence, thinking it was not in vain. They thought of their fathers and clung to the covenant. They gazed at their chains and dreamed of freedom. Even though Egypt's nights were silent, they were pulsating with prayer, hope, and the soft yet unwavering beat of a people who refused to give up on God's promise. Even though they were unable to see it yet, their deliverance was already approaching in that silence, concealed within the serene plans of heaven. With its peaks brushed by the touch of the sky and its slopes enveloped in a stillness that seemed both ancient and sacred, the mountain stood tall and silent. It had guarded the desert for many seasons, its stones worn by the passage of time, but on that day it bore a weight that had never been seen before. With his staff in hand and his mind focused on the flock he led through the rough terrain, a shepherd moved silently across its lower paths. The years he had spent in the wilderness, away from the clamor of the Pharaoh's palace and the turmoil of his people in Egypt, had molded his life into one of isolation. However, the mountain's silence was about to end because it had been selected as the location for a cry to be heard, a call that would not only move a man's heart, but also initiate the rescue of a whole people. The wilderness was nothing new to Moses. He walked its desolate areas day after day, leading the sheep that were entrusted to him while taking in the sounds of the wind as it blew over the rocks. His thoughts frequently returned to Egypt and the peculiar route that had brought him to this secret existence away from the Nile. Being a Hebrew by birth, a prince by upbringing, and now a shepherd in exile, he was a man torn between two worlds. Even though he was far away from their cries, he could still feel the weight of his people's suffering pressing down on him in the stillness of the desert nights. Something inside him stirred as if it had been waiting for him the entire time, even though the mountain loomed large in front of him and appeared to be just another ridge of stone. Moses saw something strange on the slope as the sun spanned the horizon and illuminated the rocks with its golden radiance. A flame flickered, but it wasn't burning like flames usually do. Fire danced among the branches of the tall green bush that held it. Wonder and hesitancy mixed in his chest, causing him to pause and catch his breath. There were a lot of odd sights in the desert, but nothing like this. Fire that produced no smoke, light that consumed nothing. He felt the weight of mystery as he got closer, the knowledge that this was not a common sight, but rather a sign, a message that was just waiting to be revealed. A voice from inside the flame called Moses' name as he approached, a sound that shattered the mountain's silence and pierced his very being. It was something deeper, purer, authoritative, yet gentle and considerate. It was neither the voice of man nor the cry of the wind. The voice called, "Moses, Moses," and he answered, his lips quivering. "Here I am." His heart thumped, and the earth seemed to rumble with invisible strength. Then came the order that would forever mark the occasion: "Do not approach." The shepherd, who had spent years walking the wilderness, now stood barefoot on a mountain that had been turned into a sanctuary. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground." As the flame's brightness increased, the divine's presence became more apparent. The God of his fathers, the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac, and the God of Abraham spoke, announcing his enduring covenant and generational faithfulness. Unable to look straight into the radiance of such holiness, Moses covered his face. The groaning of a people in slavery and the silence of Egypt's nights had risen, and now their cry was being heard. The voice said, "Yes, I have witnessed the suffering of my people in Egypt." In addition to being powerful, the statement, "I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering," served as a reminder that the suffering of the downtrodden is never ignored. The time had come to free the children of Israel from slavery, to take them out of Egypt and into a land full of plenty, and Moses listened as the divine voice explained the plan. The impossible task of returning to Egypt and leading the people out was given to Moses, the shepherd who was hidden away in the desert. A wave of fear swept over him. He was a man who had run away in embarrassment, a vagrant who lacked the authority, voice, and status to lead a country. "Who am I to approach Pharaoh and rescue the Israelites from Egypt?" he asked, his voice trailing off as the task's pressure mounted. The response was one of assurance rather than reprimand. The voice said, "I will be with you," and it contained the strength Moses was lacking. The flame glowed steadily, unrelenting but unconsuming, a mirror of the God who summoned him, a presence that persisted, a fire that illuminated without destroying. The mountain itself appeared to resound with the realization that this was a divine mission supported by the Almighty's hand rather than just Moses' burden. Moses still shuddered, his uncertainties growing like darkness. "Assume that when I tell the Israelites, 'The God of your fathers has sent me,' they inquire, 'What is his name?' What should I tell them then?" The response carried the weight of eternity. "I am who I am. Tell them, 'I am has sent me to you.'" The Eternal's name was revealed at that very moment, unconstrained by space or time, unconstrained by human boundaries, but existing as the origin of all being. Moses' heart trembled when he realized that the one who had called him was the same person who had created the earth and the heavens. He also felt the mountain itself bow under the weight of such words. The unfolding of destiny and the revelation of the God who had never forgotten his people were what this brief encounter was. As Moses whispered his fears, the flame's light flickered across his face, shedding light on his hesitancy. He discussed his frailty, his people's skepticism, and Pharaoh's obstinacy. But every hesitancy was accompanied by a pledge. The God of their fathers would demonstrate his might, power would be displayed, and signs would be given. The shepherd's staff that Moses held would come to represent divine authority rather than merely being a means of leading sheep. What he perceived as his weakness would turn out to be the exact platform for God's power. The mountain was transformed from stone and sand to the spot where heaven and earth met, where light and darkness met, and where a cry of longing for freedom came from the hearts of a people, not just from Moses' lips, in the quiet of that holy moment. As a sign of God's presence, the flame burned steadily and brilliantly, accompanying Moses on the entire journey. The encounter was witnessed by the mountain, whose slopes reverberated with the sound of a divine summons that would forever alter the course of history. Before the light of eternity, the shepherd who had once fled into obscurity stood barefoot, uncertain but sustained, trembling but chosen. The command uttered on the mountain was woven with the cries of Egypt's nights, which had been collected into this moment. The one who spoke from the flame was greater than Moses' doubts. greater than Pharaoh, and greater than the chains that bound his people. So even though Moses still had doubts and fears, the call could not be ignored. The mountain now glowed with the light of a response that would echo for generations after the cry had been heard. In the moonlight, the sands shimmered faintly, giving the impression that the earth itself was listening to the quiet rhythm of the heavens as the desert stretched out under the endless canopy of stars. There were no walls or ticking clocks in the wilderness. There was only the sun rising and the night falling, the moon waxing and waning, and the stars above dancing endlessly. For Moses and his followers, the breath of the desert wind, the shade of the cloud during the day, and the fire at night served as the daily indicators rather than monuments or monarchs. However, there came a time when heaven itself bowed down and the Most High's messengers showed that time was a holy gift that was meaningfully shaped and ordered rather than a restless river. Moses was once more confronted by the invisible on the mountain where the bush had once burned with fire. Despite the stillness, there was a harmony in the air, as though the cosmos itself was humming with unspoken patterns. Light suddenly appeared, a softer radiance woven like threads of starlight rather than the sun's consuming blaze. Messengers in pure clothing, whose shapes resembled reflections of the stars above, emerged from this brilliance. Their voices spoke in the rhythm of eternity, but instead of thundering, they carried a weight that sank deeply into the bones. "Time is neither Pharaoh's nor man's property," they cried, his name descending upon the stillness like dew. The one who created the heavens and set the stars on their paths is the source of time. For his people, time is a gift rather than a burden. It is a compass rather than a chain. In order for the children of Israel to live by the order of the heavens rather than the chaos of the nations, you are given the knowledge of its rhythm. The glow of their presence was too pure for Moses' eyes, and he collapsed to the ground, pressing his face against the stone. They beckoned him up, and when he looked up, he saw the stars above creating patterns and constellations that shifted like living scrolls. The sky itself unfolded as if it were a map, with each star representing a point of divine intention as the angels extended their hands. "Look," they murmured, "the calendar of the heavens." One of the messengers gestured toward the moon as it began to shimmer more brightly. "This light will serve as your gauge for the months. Your people will understand the rhythm of their days from the moment they are first a glimmer in the night sky until they reach their fullness and then fade again. They will assemble to give thanks to the Creator, who rules both day and night when the new moon rises. Let the moon and silver light serve as a reminder to them that even in the midst of darkness, a cycle of rebirth is always close by." Moses observed the moon's rapid phase changes, which served as a living example, teaching him that time was not a period of unending wandering, but rather of structured cycles of remembering. The angel then looked toward the sun, which was burning brightly, seemingly filling the entire horizon despite the fact that night was still all around them. The messenger went on to say, "And this will be your measure of seasons. You will learn about harvest and sowing, planting and reaping when the sun rises in its designated path. Its passage through the heavens will signal the start of a new year, allowing you to know when it is appropriate to get together, take a break, and give thanks. Because the sun rises every day to remind humanity that the covenant of light has not been broken, it is a symbol of faithfulness." The angels displayed the designated feasts as the stars revolved over them. Each was connected to the divine order established at the beginning of creation, rather than to human whims. When the people remember how the Mighty One freed them from Egypt and how the blood on the doors signified their freedom, there will be a feast of remembrance, one said, holding out his hand. Because it is the season of beginnings, this feast will be held in the spring, when new life blossoms. Moses saw in a vision the people eating unleavened bread, their clothes tucked at the waist, and their steps accelerated as they left bondage and entered freedom. The stars changed into a vast harvest field as another messenger raised his voice. And when the people bring what is new and fresh from their land, as an offering of thanks to the giver of all bounty, there will be a feast of first fruits. Let them keep in mind that every seed is a gift, and every harvest is a blessing from the one who gives rain and sun, not from their own efforts. The constellations glistened with golden light like low bent ears of grain. Then the vision of trumpets reverberated through the wilderness, their sound resonating through mountains and valleys. This will be a holy convocation, a day of shouting, of sounding the horn, of awakening hearts to repentance, stated another angel. Moses heard the echoes of those trumpets reverberating within his own chest, stirring something deeper than memory, something eternal, because time is not only to be lived, but also to remind the soul that eternity is approaching. As the vision continued, the Day of Atonement, the most solemn of all, became apparent. A light that was too deep for darkness to smother was visible within the shadows that moved across the stars. The messengers murmured, "The people will humble themselves and open their hearts to the one who pardons on this day." Time is the rhythm of mercy and the ongoing return of man to his Creator. It is not just cycles of days and years. The Feast of Booths, a scene of tents strewn throughout a wilderness that gleamed like glass in the darkness, came last. The angel declared, "This will be a feast of joy, a reminder that you once lived in tents, supported by the hand of heaven in a desolate land." As Moses observed families gathered beneath woven branches, their faces illuminated by lamps, laughter and prayer blending together as they rejoiced in the shelter of the Almighty, let the people rejoice before the Lord of their dwelling, who makes even the desert bloom with provision. The heavens folded back into their familiar patterns as the stars faded. The messengers stood motionless, their faces glowing with light that appeared to emanate from somewhere outside of creation. They informed him that these were holy appointments rather than just days. Every feast serves as a portal for the eternal to communicate with his people, and every season is a dialogue between heaven and earth, so that they will never forget who controls the years and who breathes each moment, keep them and teach them. Awe weighed heavily on Moses' heart. Feeling the enormity of what had been entrusted to him, he bowed once more, the stone cool under his hands. The desert had appeared desolate, but now he realized that every moonrise, sunrise, and starlight had sacred significance. Time itself was a gift of remembering, a pattern of worship, and a song written in the heavens rather than a burden of wandering. Moses stood motionless on the mountain as the messengers retreated, their light fading back into the darkness. Above him, the stars blazed with silent fire, and the reverberation of their words hung in the air like a perfume. When he understood that the people he led would follow the calendar of the heavens, which was penned by the hand of eternity rather than the calendar of kings or empires, he felt both small and carried, frail yet chosen. The night sky curved around Moses like a huge scroll of mystery as he stood motionless atop the mountain, and the air shook with a silence that was alive rather than empty. He had already seen the feasts and the cycle of the days through the messengers' voices, but now their light grew deeper into something deeper and more obscure. Around them, a glow emerged, not from the sun or moon, but from something older, something that had been etched into creation at the beginning of time. The stars appeared to pulse in a rhythm, resembling the heartbeat of eternity, and the heavens themselves appeared to sag closer. Each word of the angel's slow, low voice carried the weight of countless years. "Moses, listen to the jubilee that reigns supreme, the secret of the turning cycles, for neither days nor years pass aimlessly." In order for his people to follow the plan of heaven, the Most High set time in perfect proportion from the beginning. 364 days, neither more nor less. The number seemed to glow with meaning, and Moses listened with a trembling spirit. The calendar unfolded before Moses' eyes as the angel raised his hand. Seasons unfolded like petals of a great flower, and circles turned within circles, all of which fit into one another without any imbalance or gaps. Every 7 days echoed the rest at creation, and 7 times 7 came together to form a greater rest, a jubilee of release. It was a rhythm of weeks and Sabbaths. Like fire concealed within stone, the angel's words pierced the night. The harmony of creation is contained in this measure. Time itself follows an unbroken pattern of order, just as the earth was created. However, men will try to change it. They will count incorrectly, follow straying lights, and let the feasts fall from their rightful place. They will forget the covenant written in the sky as the days float by like sand. However, those who seek wisdom are aware of the true measure, which endures forever and is unaffected. Moses' vision expanded as he saw the sun travel through the heavens in its predetermined path, never faltering. The angel shook his head, but he could see the moon waxing and waning. The moon is not meant to control the Holy One's calendar. Rather, it is for beauty and signs, because its count is unstable and its path is uneven. The only real design is the order of the 364 days, which is set at the beginning of the year. By this metric, the feasts and Sabbaths never change, and the covenant stays in line with heaven. For the benefit of the people, you have been given the secret, the hidden Raz, which has been kept hidden from the nations. That trust weighed heavily on Moses. When trumpets sounded throughout the country, he witnessed the cycles revolving like wheels within wheels, with vast stretches of 7 years flowing into 49 and then into the 50th. This is the Jubilee sound. "Lee," the angel declared, his eyes glimmering with a light too intense for Moses to see. A period when debts are paid off, slaves are set free, and the land itself returns to its original state. Because even the earth yearns for its proper rest, and the soil retains memories. In the absence of this cycle, the land will moan under its weight, the rich will eat the poor, and men will oppress their brothers. However, the Jubilee restores equilibrium and gives creation new life. Moses continued to see generations of his people living in the land as a result of the vision. He witnessed vineyards laden with grapes, fields bent with golden harvests, and families celebrating their return to their father's estate. Since no one could claim permanent possession of what belonged to the Creator, the land was returned to the Most High's order every 50 years. The angel went on to say, "This cycle is the rhythm of freedom. The 50th year is the Sabbath of years, a release penned by the breath of the Eternal One rather than by kings or scribes, just as the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest. Men forget mercy without it. They use it to remind themselves that life is a gift rather than a possession." However, Moses' vision also became hazy, and he noticed shadows extending over the landscape. He witnessed rulers who extended chains, hoarded wealth, and disregarded the Jubilee. He witnessed feasts being forgotten, years being miscounted, and the real calendar being replaced with fictitious reckonings. The angel's tone darkened. "Yes, Moses, it will be. The 364-day measure will be abandoned by many. Their festivals will be out of place, and they will wander and look to the moon. The holy days will be profaned, and the designated times will stray. They will be confused, and their years will not line up with heaven." The creation calendar, however, is unbreakable. It stays the same, and everything will be evaluated against it in the end. Moses cried when he witnessed the anguish of disobedience, but the angel comforted him by placing a hand on his shoulder. "Servant of the Most High, do not give up, because the faithful will never forget. The heavens will lead the righteous, who will adhere to the true count. They will be aware that the Creator's design cannot be undone, and they will see the changing of the times in the stars and hear the echo of eternity in the Sabbaths. The Jubilee will turn unbroken, and the hidden Raz will remain, even when nations rage and empires rise and fall." Once more, Moses' vision changed. allowing him to see far into the future. He envisioned a time of healing, when justice would flow like a river, when the earth would find rest, and when the cycles would once again be respected. Across the horizon, trumpets sounded, not of war, but of joy, release, and return. The land itself seemed to sing as the people danced in the fields, their faces raised to the sky. The Jubilee was more than just a year at that time. It was a living reality, with creation's very pulse restored. Even though it was quieter now, the angel's voice still carried the weight of eternity. Remember, Moses, explain the cycles to them, in order for future generations to understand the hidden rayas of time. Write it down. Tell them about the 364 days, the unchanging Sabbaths, and the earth-renewing Jubilees. Because this is not human wisdom, but rather the Eternal's design, a gift to lead his people and a light to bring order to their days. As the messenger's light faded and the night fell silent again, Moses bowed low, pressing his forehead against the stone. The sacred turn of the Jubilee cycles, the unbroken measure of days, and the rhythm of creation, all pulsed within the silence, making it no longer empty. Moses also carried the weight of the mystery in his heart, knowing that the secret order of 36, 4 days held the secret to bringing heaven and earth into harmony, and that time itself was a covenant, written in the stars rather than in ink. The air became softer and the mountain became silent, as if the wind itself had stopped moving. The messenger's glow vanished into the horizon like a dream that ends in silence, and the voices that had once echoed with thunder now only whispered in memory. The enormous, glittering book of remembrance gradually started to close before Moses, as though the secrets it contained had been returned to the custody of eternity. Its pages, which had once been alive with light, folded back upon themselves. The warmth of its words lingered like the last embers of a fire, glowing softly in the heart, so the silence was not emptiness. The secret book lay once more, alive in the viewer's soul, but no longer visible to the naked eye. Its closing made a soft, gentle sound, like the last breath before sleep, or the silence of evening spreading across a valley. As if they, too, carried shards of the tale in their gleaming paths, the stars above appeared to slant closer. The stillness of the earth held a secret harmony, and a sweetness that was more felt than heard hung in the air. It seemed as though the mountain itself had taken on the role of a witness, preserving the memory within its rocks and preserving the echo of words that were too profound to fade. The book lay quietly, but its light did not go out. It had already seeped into the secret rhythm of creation itself, into the memory of the faithful, and into Moses's heart. No longer constrained by voice or parchment, the words had transformed into something like water seeping into the ground, invisible yet feeding everything that would eventually grow. Once carried, a flame doesn't have to burn in front of the eyes, because it takes root inside and glows subtly during the dark days. The book's closing was a return, a folding back into the eternal where beginnings and endings are one rather than an end. Its rest was comparable to a seed dormant in the earth, containing the invisible promise of life. More than knowledge was carried by whoever carried its memory. They also carried a silent light, a lamp concealed in the chest that guided in silence. The light had already jumped over the veil and found a place in the hearts of those who were willing to remember, even though the mountain would remain empty and the pages would never turn again for mortal eyes. The night grew darker, but it was not dark. It resembled a large blanket of peace that was gently spread across the sky. The earth appeared to breathe slowly, content with the order that had been established from the start, while the stars flickered softly, as if whispering the story still. The world was different when the hidden book rested again, because its light had spilled out in a gentle glow that no shadow could smother. Hearts also lay in that glow, bearing the silent truth of a tale that had never really come to an end, but had instead only faded into quiet, akin to a lullaby that continues to reverberate even after the last note has been played.